You stand at the edge of the field where the wind forgets to blow. The sun has not yet risen, but the sky has lightened just enough to see the pale outline of chalk traced across the flattened earth. A grid imperfect but deliberate, carved into the soil with worn hands and patient memory. Nothing has been built yet. No column, no arch, no sound of hammer or pulley. Only this, a pattern sketched on the ground, full of anticipation, like a breath drawn and held in the chest of the world. You arrived before the others, just as your master taught you. The best light is always the soft light of dawn, when shadows are long and the air is still dry. The dew clings to your sandals and your fingers, calloused from measurement and rope. Unroll the wax tablet that contains the ratios you memorized but still fear to forget. This space will become something, if your lines are true, if your calculations hold. This is where it always begins, not with glory or grandeur, not with the shout of orders or the clash of tools, but in silence, the kind of silence that asks if you're ready. Behind you, the carts will arrive soon, wooden wheels groaning beneath the weight of raw limestone, volcanic ash, and quarried tufa. Men will unload them with grunts and curses, sweat beading before the sun has even cleared the hills. But they know nothing of this silence. They only see stone and labor. You see the invisible shape of something vast, coiled in the dust, waiting for form. You kneel. Your fingers touch the outer line, the ambitus, where the perimeter of the building will rise. And already, you feel it, the ghost of a wall, the echo of an atrium, the arch that does not yet exist. There is power in drawing nothing and knowing it will become something. That power once belonged to the gods alone. Now, it rests in your humble tools, plumbline, groma, wax, string, chalk. You mark the cardinal points, not by guessing, but by reading the stars the night before, using a polished bowl of water to reflect the heavens as the augurs taught. The alignment is not only mathematical, it is sacred. A building constructed without respect for the sun's path will rot in shadow. You have seen this before in other cities, by other hands, and so you walk slowly, deliberately, measuring by footstep and cord, mapping the points as if you were stitching the earth back together. The site is not ideal. It slopes slightly westward. There is a vein of soft clay that will complicate the foundation. But no site is perfect, and Roman builders do not wait for perfection. You adjust. You reinforce the outline, shift the inner corridor, reduce the curve of one apse so that the load can distribute across the bedrock with more confidence. These are not guesses. They are acts of experience learned from collapsed columns, sunken floors, and roofs that let rain bleed through mortar like old wounds. Your mind drifts, for a moment, to the buildings that came before, not the grand temples or triumphal arches, but the simple ones, the bridge that held through winter, the cistern that never cracked. Those were the real triumphs. No inscription marks the names of those who calculated those walls, but you remember, and you hope quietly that someday someone will walk through this structure, feel the coolness of its shade, and not think of you at all. That would mean you succeeded. Voices approach, the quiet ends. They are laborers from the countryside, speaking in dialects that bend Latin like wet reeds. They don't ask what the lines mean. They don't need to. You point. They nod. Some are veterans of other projects. Others are boys who will lose their backs to this before their faces show their age. A few carry scars from collapses. One walks with a limp but still carries a pickaxe. You respect them more than they know. Without them, your mind remains theory. With them, it becomes structure. They begin to dig. The outlines become trenches. Dust rises. Tools clink against rock. Someone coughs. A wheelbarrow tips and spills. The illusion is broken. The purity of the plan, its calm geometry, its sacred symmetry is gone now, replaced by the chaos of real things. You feel a pang of regret, watching the first chalk line be erased by a heel. But that is always the cost. A plan must vanish to make room for what is real. Your master once said, "The first stone is not the one they see. It is the one you place in your mind and never remove." You didn't understand then. You do now. The foundation stones arrive mid-morning, rough-hewn blocks, their corners chipped, their faces stained from the ox carts. You had ordered better, but this is what you receive. You choose carefully. The first stone matters not for appearance, but for bearing. You set it low, into the deepest part of the trench. Press it with your hand, as if giving it a final command. You whisper a word, not because it will listen, but because you need to hear it hold. As the walls rise, they will obscure this moment. No one will remember the line of chalk. No one will see the footstep you carved at the southern end, just to center the axis. No one will know the hours you spent arguing with your own diagrams. But the building will know. It will remember, in the way it settles without cracking, in how it takes rain and sends it away, in the shadow that falls precisely where you wanted shade. You step back. From a distance, it still looks like nothing, just earth turned over and men swearing in dust. But you know better. You see the future temple, or bath, or market, not as a fantasy, but as a structure that has already chosen to exist. All you're doing is catching up to it. There is something holy about that. The sun is higher now. It burns the back of your neck. Your tunic sticks to your chest. You drink from a shared skin of water and let the heat remind you that even the gods built under a sky like this. The cranes are not yet here. The scaffolds will come later. Today is not for height, it is for depth, for getting under the skin of the ground and asking it what it will allow. You walk the perimeter again, slowly, checking angles, rechecking them. It would be easy to trust your first marks, but you have seen what arrogance does to buildings. It is better to doubt than build. A child runs, by son of one of the workers, chasing a lizard between the stones. He does not see you. He does not see anything but movement and sunlight. But in a strange way, he is right. This place is alive now. The lizard will not run here tomorrow. The dust will turn to floor. The voices will echo off walls that do not yet stand. You pause and stare out across the open frame. You imagine the atrium catching rain in its basin, the floor mosaic glinting wet under the light. You imagine the columns not yet carved casting shadows in regular intervals, the smells of wet plaster, the cold touch of marble at sunrise. You are not dreaming. You are remembering something that has not happened yet. The silence you began with is gone, replaced with rhythm, but underneath it all, a quieter silence remains. The silence beneath the noise, the one that still holds the weight of everything to come. And as you walk back toward your tools, you realize something both comforting and cruel. No matter how many buildings you raise, no matter how many lines you draw, you will always begin again. You will always return to a field before the sun rises, to chalk lines in dirt, to questions no one else asks. Because this is not just construction. It is faith measured in stone. You sift the soil through your fingers, watching it fall in slow, uneven threads. It is dry, granular, and strangely fragrant, the scent of earth touched by ash and time. Beneath your sandals, the same substance lies packed into ruts where oxen carts have passed, into corners where water once pooled, into the lungs of men who have worked this land longer than records recall. This dust, humble and coarse, is more than residue. It is memory. It is the origin of everything Rome has built. You have been told that marble is the symbol of power, that granite, with its defiant shimmer, is what makes a city eternal. But those are illusions polished for the eye. Beneath every gleaming facade is the truth earth, broken down, sifted, and reborn into structure. The finest walls begin with the ugliest dust. The most enduring triumphs are laid upon things unremarkable. You do not need to imagine this. You see it each day. The tufa quarried from nearby hills, soft and porous, cut into blocks with hands that tremble from the repetition of labor. The travertine, bright as bleached bone, drawn from deeper layers where water once passed and left behind its hardened breath. The pozzolana, volcanic ash scooped from the scarred hills of Puteoli and Baiae, black and fine as ground ink, used to make cement that cures underwater. These materials, so often overlooked, form the foundation of greatness. There is no glamour in collecting them. You have walked the paths from quarry to city, your cart laden unevenly, the wheels struggling through mud after spring rains. You have bartered with men whose fingernails are blackened, whose eyes are dulled from years in stone pits. They speak little, mostly in gesture, but they know what the land holds. They can tell the weight of a boulder from the sound it makes when tapped. They know which slope will yield good lime and which will rot a wall within a season. Their silence is not ignorance, it is reverence. The empire was not built on marble. It was built on choices like these. You remember one such journey clearly. The sun had not yet risen, and the road twisted between jagged hills where the wind cried without rhythm. You had gone to inspect a vein of reddish stone, said to resist both moisture and insects. What you found was a narrow ridge where every step dislodged gravel. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, but beneath the surface lay the very thing you needed. You knelt for hours, scraping samples, testing hardness, sketching notes in a wax tablet with your knuckles raw from cold. You returned to the site alone, the stone heavy on your back, and poured the dust into your palm. Even then, before it was shaped or mixed or fired, you could feel the promise it carried. Back at the worksite, the process begins with crushing. Men swing weighted hammers against rock set on wide, flat stones. The rhythm is steady, almost meditative, a metronome of civilization. You watch as larger chunks yield to the tools, shattering into fragments, then powder. The air becomes thick. Those without cloth over their mouths begin to cough. You make note of their names and order linen wraps. You have seen what this dust does to lungs. You know how quickly a mason can become a shadow. Lime must be made next. The raw stone, once broken, is piled into kilns tall, circular structures lined with clay and sealed tight except for the mouth at the base. Wood is fed in continuously, the fire stoked over many hours until the stone glows from within. The transformation is violent, invisible to the eye but audible through the walls. The rock screams as it releases its water and becomes something new. When it cools, it will crumble at a touch, ready to mix with water into paste. That paste, when blended with sand and pozzolana, becomes cement opus caementicium, the quiet magic of Rome. It does not dry the way clay does. It cures, slowly, chemically, as if thinking through its shape. Once set, it hardens forever. No frost can break it. No salt can corrode it. Not even the sea can undo it. That is why you use it to bind aqueducts that cross valleys, to form harbors that anchor fleets, to build cisterns deep beneath temples where water will sit for decades untouched by light. But concrete alone is not enough. You must understand how to use it. You cannot pour it all at once. It must be layered between stones, tamped carefully so air does not remain trapped, so that every crevice holds integrity. You must watch the weather, for rain will dilute it, and summer heat will rob it of the moisture it needs to cure evenly. And then there is the matter of formwork. Wooden molds, carefully measured, reinforced by struts, soaked so they do not warp, must be in place before the mixture can be poured. It is a dance of planning, weight, and trust. One misstep, and the entire structure can tilt, crack, or collapse within a season. The men you work with understand this, or at least, they follow your hand when you draw diagrams in the dust. Some cannot read, but they can feel a wall with their fists and tell you if the mortar was too wet. They will argue, sometimes, over whether the sand was coarse enough, whether the last batch had the right ratio of ash. You listen, because they are not wrong. Experience is its own form of education. It leaves calluses instead of ink. At midday, you walk among the storage piles. Under canvas tarps lie heaps of crushed limestone, baskets of red clay, barrels of sand from riverbeds miles away. You run your fingers through each, inspecting texture and moisture, judging readiness. A builder who does not touch his materials does not truly know them. A mistake made here will not reveal itself until months later, when a beam shifts or a wall buckles under unexpected strain. You think of other cities, Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, and wonder if their builders walked with this same sense of weight, not the weight of stone, but of responsibility. You are not building for yourself. These walls will outlive your body. What you assemble now will house generations. It will be mistaken for permanence. And yet you know better. You have seen buildings fail. The slow sag of arches built too wide. The crumble of facades when floods find their way beneath. The collapse of towers that reached higher than the materials could bear. Rome does not like to speak of its failures, but you do. You must. Each one is a lesson etched into your process. You are not here to copy the past. You are here to listen to it, argue with it, and improve upon it where you can. As the sun lowers and the light flattens across the yard, the dust settles for the day. Your hands are caked in white. Your arms ache from lifting, measuring, guiding, and yet you feel no exhaustion. Only a strange peace that comes from knowing you are part of something larger than yourself, not because of ego, but because of service. You do not command an empire, you serve its gravity. You return to your wax tablet one last time, adjusting a measurement, sketching a revised join between wall and arch, a minor correction, but one that may mean the difference between a hairline fracture and structural wholeness. This is how you sleep not in dreams, but in revisions. When the wind rises again, it lifts a sheet of dust across the yard, blinding for a moment. You turn away, let it pass, then look back. The ground is bare again, stripped of detail, but you know it was not for nothing. Beneath that blanket of dust is the outline of a future drawn from the earth itself. Tomorrow, you will build upon it, and the dust, once more, will rise. There is something unsettling about the way it moves. The mixture starts as a paste, almost sluggish in its resistance, reluctant to be stirred, yet alive with potential. It sticks to the edges of the trough like honey gone to sleep. And then, with the right balance of water and pozzolana, the substance begins to yield, becoming neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, something on the verge of choosing its final form. You dip your hand into the basin slowly, feeling the weight of it slide over your skin. The temperature is oddly warm, the grains coarse, the consistency thick and defiant. It clings to your fingers as if unwilling to let go. This is not like mixing sand with lime, not like mortar, which dries out too quickly or crumbles when exposed to weather. This is older, deeper, more alive. Opus caementitium. Roman concrete is not a material. It is a transformation in motion. No one outside Rome understands it fully. Not the Greeks with their precise columns and carved pediments. Not the Carthaginians, whose walls crumbled when rainwater found their weak lime. Not even the tribes of the north, who still build with timber and dream of permanence. Rome's mastery lies not in marble, but in the dust that bonds, in the ash that remembers heat. The secret is hidden in plain sight volcanic earth. You learned this from your master, not through lecture, but by repetition, day after day, watching him test mixtures, scrape samples from cured walls, break open cores of hardened cement to examine their density and fracture. He would say, "Lime binds, pozzolana lives." At the time, you did not understand. Now, after years of observation and ruin, you do. Pozzolana is volcanic ash drawn from the sleeping mouths of ancient mountains. It contains within it the memory of fire, the residue of eruption, the fine particles that once floated across the sky like punishment. When combined with lime and water, it does not merely dry, it reacts. It fuses at a level unseen, forming structures that resist decay, even when submerged. It cures not by air, but by magic, or so it seems. The process, once you begin, must be followed precisely. The lime must first be slaked, mixed with water, and allowed to hiss and seethe, releasing steam and softening into a chalky paste. Then the pozzolana is added, a dark powder that turns the mixture a grayish hue, absorbing the moisture slowly, thickening the brew until it begins to resist the trowel. At this stage, sand is folded in, not merely as filler, but as structure. The grains interlock, the ash weaves between them, and the paste becomes something that holds shape. You remember one morning when the ratio was off, when the lime had sat too long in the kiln and came out brittle. The concrete poured that day cracked weeks later, a hairline fissure that spread like an infection through the northern wall. No one else noticed, but you did. You saw the way the surface bowed ever so slightly, the way water refused to run evenly down its slope. You marked it in your tablet and corrected the formula. The wall was taken down and remade. You said nothing to the patron. That kind of failure is a private burden, one borne by those who understand the cost of shortcuts. There are other secrets, too. Timing, for one. The mixture cannot be left sitting. Once combined, it must be used within hours, or it begins to stiffen and refuse the mold. The placement must be steady and uninterrupted. When poured between stones, it must be tamped evenly, layer upon layer, with no pockets of air. If trapped, those voids will expand in summer and shatter in winter. If left uneven, the weight distribution will falter, and the wall will tilt under strain. You must also account for temperature. In the heat of midsummer, the mixture loses water too quickly, leaving the surface brittle while the core remains soft. In the chill of early spring, the curing process slows to near stillness, delaying the set and inviting damp. The worksite must be prepared for both. You have learned to cover your molds with canvas to shield them from sudden rain, to wet the formwork with water to prevent the wood from leaching moisture, to insulate the drying concrete with straw during unexpected cold nights. Most of all, you have learned the discipline of patience. There are moments, after the pour is done, when the concrete lies still in its mold, indistinguishable from clay or mud. Workers pass by without noticing. Supervisors glance once and look away. But you remain. You sit beside it, watching for subtle changes, the way the surface tightens, the way the edge lifts slightly from the frame. It is during this silence that the true miracle occurs, without sound or heat, without any visible sign. The mixture begins to knit itself into stone, and once it has begun, it cannot be reversed. It was this very secret that built the Pantheon's dome. No scaffolding could reach that high. No beam could span that width. And yet it stands, because of concrete that cured in layers, each one lighter than the last, mixed with pumice and tufa to reduce weight, poured in rings that supported one another as they rose into the heavens. The dome is not a shell over a chamber, it is the chamber, the sky turned to stone. You have studied that structure with reverence, not only for its beauty, but for its logic. The composition changes as it rises, the base thick and dense, the crown light and airy, the oculus, a gaping eye at the top, is not a flaw, but a relief valve, letting air and weight escape in equal measure. You have traced your fingers along its inner curve, felt the rougher texture where the mix was altered, noted the places where scaffolding left marks in the concrete that still speak to the men who built it. These secrets are passed quietly, from hand to hand, not through writing. The formulas are not etched in stone, but in behavior. You recognize a master builder not by his title, but by the way he kneels to examine a pour, by how he tests the mixture with the edge of his trowel, by the patience with which he watches something that others dismiss as finished. The laborers who carry the mix in baskets on their backs do not know what they carry. To them, it is weight, nothing more. But you sometimes wonder if they feel its potential, if the heat they feel against their skin is more than just sun, if, for a moment, they recognize that they are carrying the future of the empire on their shoulders, wet, heavy, and silent. There is irony in this, that the greatest strength of Roman architecture lies in something soft before it becomes strong, that it begins as weakness, as mixture, as mess. The same way Rome itself began, not with walls, but with the gathering of dust, of tribes, of strangers. The city, too, was once a slurry, thick with contradiction and ambition. It took time to harden into empire. You rise from the edge of the curing mold and walk the length of the wall. Behind it, the scaffolding creaks softly in the wind. A boy balances on a beam, carrying a pail of wet mix, his face taut with focus. You watch him pause, breathe, and pour. The concrete spreads and settles. Another layer, another future made tangible. In the fading light of evening, you make one final inspection. You test the edges for firmness. Press the center with your palm. Feel the resistance. It is not ready yet, but it will be. And when it is, it will no longer be a mixture. It will be structure. It will hold weight. It will be something that resists time, even if only for a while. You understand now why the old builders whispered before they poured the first batch, why they called it a spell. Because this material does not simply fill space, it transforms it. It makes permanence from impermanence, form from flux. It is not just ash and lime and water. It is memory, crystallized. And tomorrow, when the wall is dry, no one will see what it was. No one will know the hours you spent staring at a basin of gray. No one will remember how it moved, or how it clung to your skin like a reluctant thought. But you will, and that is enough. You step beneath the skeleton of wooden scaffolding, craning your neck slowly upward, as if asking the sky for permission. Above you, timber, cord, tension. Around you, noise, dust, breath. But your eyes are fixed on the space not yet filled. A void, wide and daring. A promise still suspended in air. This is where the vault will rise. And everything about it says it should not. The first time you saw a true Roman vault, you were barely old enough to carry a bucket. Your father had taken you into the city for the Saturnalia, and among the chaos of revelers and drums and painted faces, he led you not to a temple, not to a shrine, but to a basilica still under construction. He said nothing as you entered. He only pointed up. What you saw there never left you. A ceiling, curved like the belly of a great beast, suspended impossibly above an open space where people walked freely without columns, without beams, without fear. The light touched it at angles you did not understand then, tracing the ribs of a stone canopy that seemed both massive and weightless. How could anything so heavy remain aloft? How could it bend instead of breaking? You asked your father what magic held it. He only smiled and said, "The kind that obeys rules the rest of us haven't learned yet." Years later, you would learn those rules. You would kneel beside diagrams drawn in ash on marble floors. You would run your hands along old voussoirs, feeling for imperfections. You would rebuild failed models with your master until your fingers bled from scraping dried mortar off reused stones. You would memorize not just the shapes, but the stress. You would understand that the strength of a vault is not in its material, but in the way it teaches weight to move. That is the first lesson you pass on to every new apprentice. A vault does not resist gravity, it redirects it. It is a trick of direction and discipline. Each stone, from the springing point to the keystone, leans not on empty air, but on its neighbor. Like soldiers in formation, they carry each other. Fail to place one at the right angle, and the entire curve collapses. Misalign the thrust, and the outward force pushes the walls until they crack. Forget the buttress, and the illusion becomes rubble. You remind them that a vault is not built upwards, it is built inward. The centering the temporary wooden framework is the invisible god of this process, shaped like the curve of the final vault. It holds the weight until the stone can hold itself. It must be exact, too wide, and the arch will stretch, too narrow, and the stones will sit loose. The wood must be seasoned, cut to precision, and braced from beneath so it does not sag under its own span. Before a single brick is laid, the centering must be perfect, because once the keystone is placed and the centering is removed, there is no correction. The vault either stands or it does not. You run your hand along the inner edge of the formwork, feeling for irregularities, tapping softly. Your eyes squint, not from light, but from memory calculating stress angles, compensating for temperature, humidity, wind. The workers do not ask questions. They wait. They know better than to rush this stage. A vault does not forgive. Once the centering is ready, the first stones are carried in wedge-shaped blocks called voussoirs, chiseled with care so their edges taper just so. They arrive in carts lined with straw, guarded like relics. These are not rough stones. These are instruments of tension. Their angles must be respected, their surfaces smooth, their joints dry-fitted before any mortar is applied. The laying begins at the spring line, the point where the wall surrenders its upward climb and agrees to curve. The voussoirs are placed symmetrically, one on the left, then one on the right. Climbing upward in mirrored rhythm, the space narrows with each pair. As it does, the silence deepens, not because the workers stop speaking, but because something sacred has entered the room the moment where human hands imitate the movement of the earth, where chaos becomes order and force finds balance. You do not allow the apprentices to lay the keystone. That task is reserved, not for pride, but for caution. The keystone is not just a capstone, it is the declaration that the vault is ready to live. You carry it up the scaffold yourself, hands trembling not from fear, but from precision. The stone is slightly larger than the others, shaped to lock the curve into stillness. As you lower it into place, the voussoirs lean against it, and in that instant, the weight transfers. Nothing changes in appearance. No sound marks the moment, but you feel it in the bones of the structure, in the way the scaffolding no longer strains, in the hush that falls like dust settling. The centering remains for 3 days. You inspect the joints each morning, noting any movement, testing each contact point with a thin blade. On the 4th day, you allow the supports to be lowered. Breath held. As the final beam is eased away, the vault sighs into itself and holds. The workers do not cheer, they nod. Only you know what almost happened. Only you carry the map of failure that could have unfolded had the centering shifted, had the voussoir been misaligned by a finger's width, had the mortar been too thin or too thick. These are the distances between a miracle and a massacre. You have seen both. There was once a bathhouse outside Capua, where the vault collapsed just months after completion. The water had soaked into the wall, weakened the lime. It gave way during the night. 4 slaves died beneath the rubble. When you arrived to inspect, the scent of damp ash still hung in the air. You found the fault not in the materials, but in the ambition of the builder. He had pushed for span over strength, refused to thicken the buttresses, had even shaved the voussoir for beauty. You traced his name once into your tablet, then erased it. You learned this. Too beauty is nothing if it cannot bear weight. You walk beneath the completed vault now, running your fingers along the inner curve, feeling where the mortar dried with slight variation, noting the grain of the stones, the minor misalignments invisible to the eye, but present like soft ripples in a pond. You do not aim for perfection. Perfection is brittle. You aim for endurance. When sunlight passes through the high windows and curves along the vault, it mimics the path of pressure. You have always found that beautiful not in the decorative sense, but in the way light follows strength. A vault is not meant to be seen from above. It is meant to hold space, to shelter emptiness, to define what stands beneath it. You pause in the center. The air is cool here, still. Sound behaves differently. Your own footfalls seem to echo slower, as if time moves with reluctance beneath the arch. This is not superstition. It is structure. The vault above you is made of thousands of decisions, measurements, adjustments, refusals, compromises, but no one will ever see them. The patrons will look up and marvel at the height, at the curve, at the lack of columns. They will never know the night you stayed awake worrying that the central voussoir had been chipped in transport. They will never know the moment you nearly rejected the scaffolding because one of the beams carried a soft knot that could have buckled under rain. These are not things they need to know, but you remember them all, because that is the price of mastery, not the work itself, but the invisible ledger you keep of every moment the structure might have failed. Later, the vault will be decorated, painted with stars or myth, perhaps inlaid with gold leaf, or covered in coffered plaster to reduce weight and delight the eye. But beneath all that splendor is the curve you carved from logic and labor. And long after the paint fades, long after names are forgotten and floors are replaced, the vault will remain. It will carry the silence of those who passed beneath it, their breath bouncing softly off its curve. That is what makes it sacred. Not that it was built, but that it stayed. You run your palm along the base of the column, fingertips tracing the cold grooves of the fluting. The stone is cleanly cut, its lines precise, the capital still wrapped in cloth to protect it from the dust of carving. From a distance, it appears whole monolithic, grand, inviolable. Visitors will marvel at it. The wealthy patrons who pass through the forum will tilt their heads skyward and speak of its perfection, of its strength, of how it must have taken dozens of men to raise it whole from the quarry. And none of it will be true. This column, like most, is not carved from a single massive stone. It is a lie shaped in precision, a fiction told in drums. The illusion begins at the base, where the first segment is anchored with a careful mixture of lime and lead, aligned to a central dowel hammered into the foundation. Each subsequent piece, identical in diameter, but subtly varying in height, is lowered into place with ropes and ramps, rotated minutely to align the flutes, and sealed with a thin paste of pozzolanic mortar so fine it disappears into the seam. Once set, the joint vanishes. The stone becomes a single body in the eyes of those who do not know better. And that is the intention. The illusion is not ornamental. It is structural, psychological, almost spiritual. You were taught early that no one builds a monolithic column unless the quarry sits in the middle of the temple. To move such a stone intact would require divine effort or endless coin. Neither is common. Instead, the Romans perfected something subtler, building in segments that pretend to be whole. Every city you've worked in hides such secrets. In some places, the drums are made of travertine and coated with stucco. In others, brick cores are wrapped in carved marble. There are even porticos where the stone is no more than plaster molded and painted to resemble strength. But you do not judge this deception harshly. You recognize it for what it is, practicality disguised as grandeur. The decision to lie is not careless. It is deliberate, considered. It must be, because a poorly constructed column invites failure more than a poorly laid wall. It carries weight in an exposed form, a kind of visible vulnerability. If it buckles, it will not crack in silence. It will fall like a tree into the heart of the space it was meant to dignify. And so each choice becomes a matter of life, not style. You must assess not only the material, but the illusion itself. Will it endure scrutiny? Will it survive generations of weather, pressure, ritual, war? You remember the first time you saw a column fail? It was in a lesser villa along the Via Latina. The columns were too slender, the drums too hastily cut. Rain had seeped between the joints, freezing at night, expanding with enough pressure to fracture the thin mortar. No one noticed, not at first. Then one morning, without storm, without wind, without warning, the entire portico dropped. 3 slaves died instantly. Their names never made it to record. But you trace the cause to the fault line between the second and third drum, an unsealed seam, exposed and forgotten. You have never forgotten. That is why today, on this site, you test every drum before it rises. You measure the curve of each flute. Run your fingers across the edges, searching for irregularities. You strike the stone with your knuckles to hear its voice. A true piece sings with a low, deep note. A flawed one sounds flat. You discard those that do not sing. You choose not just by shape, but by resonance. When the time comes to raise them, you prepare the ramps days in advance. Timber beams, earth-packed, reinforced with stone and lined with smooth planks, ascending at a shallow incline. The drums are wrapped in straw and leather, lifted slowly with pulleys and teams of men moving in rhythm. The ropes are thick, oiled, checked twice at every handoff. The air during such lifts is taut, not with noise, but with breath held in unison. The margin for error is narrow. One slip of rope, one imbalance in the hall, and the stone will shatter not only itself, but morale. And when the drum is set upon the one below, you kneel, you guide, you whisper, you do not shout, you do not rush. You feel the moment when weight meets weight, when the upper block settles into the thin bed of mortar, and you know by the sound, by the shift in pressure, that the contact is clean. Once the stack is complete, the capital is placed. This, too, is rarely one piece. Often it is carved in sections, then assembled like a puzzle, its joins disguised by sculpted detail. A Corinthian capital, with its curling acanthus leaves and spiraled volutes, is a masterwork of both art and concealment. The eyes of the public will be drawn to its flourishes, not its seams, but you will always see the seams. You always must. After the capital comes the entablature, the heavy stone beam that rests atop the column's summit. Here, the deception must be even more precise. The column must bear not only its own height, but the load of the structure above architraves, friezes, sometimes even a pediment. That weight will press down for centuries. It will shift as earthquakes ripple, as wind pushes sideways, as thousands walk beneath it, and the column must not move, not by a finger's width, not by a sigh. So you test the final alignment with plumb lines, with weighted cords dropped from great heights, with measurements taken at dawn when the air is most still. You walk the colonnade in silence, counting the intervals by pace, scanning the shadows to see if they bend as they should. You listen, not with your ears, but with your presence. You've come to believe that a column speaks before it breaks, not in words, but in hesitation, in a way light bends differently across its surface, in a tremble felt through the scaffolding long before any crack appears. Still, the deception is not always pure. In some buildings, you have been instructed to create beauty from compromise. The columns must appear evenly spaced, even if the underlying foundation shifts or the walls do not permit it. You adjust proportions subtly. You widen one bay by a finger, narrow another. You tilt the capitals slightly to catch light in a more forgiving arc. And when the client arrives, dressed in silk and sandals too clean for a sight like this, they will nod and smile and believe they are standing in the company of gods. They are not wrong, but they do not know how carefully the illusion has been held together. In the quiet hours after the crew has left, you sometimes sit at the edge of the colonnade and sketch, not for plans or records, for memory. You draw the columns as they are. Then, as they seem, you label the joins, the dowels, the places where decisions were made, where weakness was hidden beneath grace. These sketches are for you alone. You never show them, not because you are ashamed, but because you know that every builder must keep a record of his illusions, not to protect them, but to honor them. The truth behind the lie is what gives the structure its soul. One day, someone will walk through this space and believe the columns were born here, that they rose from the ground fully formed, immune to time, untouched by doubt. They will not see the hands that sanded the seams, the shoulders that bore the weight, the arguments over angle and width. They will not know the conversations held in the dust between two men trying to decide whether a quarter-inch gap is too much to risk. And that is the point. The columns do not need to tell the truth. They only need to stand. Because a lie that holds is stronger than a truth that breaks. You stand on the edge of a low ridge at dawn, the wind carrying the chill of river mist up into your sleeves, and in the distance, beyond the fold of olive groves and the dark spine of the hills, The line of arches moves across the land like a procession of silent giants. They do not shift. They do not rest. They carry no weapon, wear no crown, but their presence commands the same reverence as an army. They march not with violence, but with water. You have followed this line for days, tracing its path from the mountain springs of the high Sabine slopes, past groves where the earth still breathes sulfur from ancient wounds, down toward the shallow valley where the outer districts of the city begin to breathe their dust into the wind. The aqueduct is not just a structure. It is a vow written in stone. It promises that the city will not thirst. What astonishes you still, even after years of study, is not simply that it works, but how little it asks for in return. It does not rely on pressure, not on force, but on patience. The water flows not because of pumps or magic, but because the builders knew how to find the gentlest descent, one drop for every 100 paces. That is all it takes to bring the mountain down to the marble courtyards. You remember the first time you saw Spicus, the covered channel, at the heart of the aqueduct, uncovered during an inspection just outside the old walls of Praeneste. It was no wider than your shoulders, lined with lime mortar so smooth it felt like the inside of a shell. A trickle of water still ran through it, though the source had long been diverted. In that moment, you realized that the majesty of the aqueduct was not in its arches, but in its quiet. The water didn't roar, it whispered. And yet, to protect that whisper, entire valleys were conquered. To carry water across uneven terrain is to tame both earth and sky. The engineers must become translators, listening to the land, measuring its slopes, mapping its winds. When the gradient dips too low, they dig a trench. When it rises too steeply, they bore a tunnel. And when the land cannot be dug or drilled, they build arches, bridges, stacked upon one another like vertebrae, stretching across ravines, climbing over ridges, always reaching without ever climbing too fast. Because if the water falls too quickly, it will tear itself apart. If it falls too slowly, it will stall. And so the aqueduct walks. Each arch is measured not only by height, but by consequence. It must be wide enough to carry the load, narrow enough to resist the wind. The stones are fitted dry, locked by gravity and friction, often without mortar. The pressure of the upper stones keeps the arch compressed, and therefore standing. The blocks themselves must be shaped to bear not only their own weight, but the weight of memory, because every failure is remembered. There are legends among builders of a bridge outside Tiber that collapsed on its first day, not because the stones were weak, but because the aqueduct had been rushed. The slope had not been tested properly. The curve of the central arch was slightly too wide. When the first flow was released, the force was too great, the walls too brittle. The water struck the base like a hammer and drove a crack through the keystone. It fell within minutes. You've seen the remnants of few jagged stones still jutting from the riverbed like broken teeth. You remind your apprentices of this when they ask why you walk the line 10 times before giving approval. You tell them, water is not gentle, it only seems so. The pressure of it constant, subtle, can unmake a city. That's why the aqueduct must be more than accurate. It must be vigilant. Maintenance is not an afterthought. It is a ritual. The curatores aquarum, those who oversee the waters, walk the line weekly. They inspect joints, remove roots, patch cracks. You have walked with them more than once, and it is a strange kind of worship, stooping to listen for leaks, brushing away moss, testing flow with cups. You recall once finding a section of wall where a small fig tree had rooted between stones. Its trunk was thin, its leaves gentle in the breeze. But its roots had split the outer layer of the masonry. Left unchecked, it would have widened that split year by year, drinking from the very artery it threatened to destroy. You cut it down with your own hand, because that is what a builder does. He protects what he cannot control. The arches, for all their grandeur, are only the visible spine. Most of the aqueduct runs underground through dark tunnels, where air becomes stale, and the only sound is the drip of condensation. These sections are dug with patience and darkness. Men work by torchlight, their breaths loud in the silence, their picks echoing off walls too narrow to turn in. When you design these tunnels, you do so with claustrophobia as a constant. You must map the curves before they curve. You must plan for light, for slope, for heat. And when those tunnels emerge again into daylight, when they rise into the open and resume their march across the land, it feels less like construction and more like revelation. The land itself parts, and the aqueduct continues, silent and loyal. There are cities now with more than one line. Rome has 11, some new, some ancient. Some carry clean spring water for drinking. Others carry mineral-rich water for baths. They cross and intersect in dizzying patterns, but they never mix. The builders knew better. Each water has its purpose, its destination, its own temperament. Mixing them leads to stagnation, disease, protest. Even the poor know the difference. They line up at the lacus, the public fountains, with amphorae etched with marks, one for drinking, one for cooking, one for cleaning. And though they do not know your name, they depend on your precision. That is what humbles you most. Not the architecture, not the size, not the beauty, but the trust. The fact that someone miles away will drink what flows through your arches, that a girl will wash her face with the water you guided, that a sick boy will bathe in a bath warmed by water you kept moving, that the aqueduct, though it speaks no word and claims no temple, is one of the most sacred things Rome has built. It does not glorify the emperor. It does not shine in gold. It does not sing of conquest. But it gives life, and it does so without ever asking to be seen. You pause now at a section nearing completion. The arches have reached the final ridge before descending toward the city. Below, you see the workmen aligning the trough where the water will run. The channel is lined with waterproof mortar, its curve smooth, its surface leveled with careful sticks and water tests. You kneel beside the foreman and ask for the last flow reading. He hands you a clay marker with the measurement. It's steady, within range, not perfect, but well within the margin. You smile, but only faintly, because you know that perfection here is not a number. It is a rhythm. It is that moment when the water flows uninterrupted for days, then weeks, then years, when no one hears it, and yet it arrives. That is how you know you've done your work. In time, vines will climb the arches, birds will nest in their cracks, the city will expand and build against the base. Children will climb and laugh and drop pebbles into the channel. Generations will pass beneath its shadow without ever wondering how it was built. And that will be the true mark of its success. Not that it was noticed, but that it was trusted. You enter the city not by gate, but by line. It is not a line that others can see, not marked with banners, not guarded with spears, but you feel it all the same. A shift in geometry, a change in rhythm, the road beneath your feet, so long winding and bent by hill and valley, now runs straight. The stones are tighter, the slope deliberate. The sun begins to fall in perfect right angles along the wall beside you. You are no longer in nature. You are inside intention. Because Roman cities do not grow, they are drawn. They begin not with structures. but with two lines, the cardo and the decumanus, the north-south and east-west axes around which every other element orients itself. These are not roads merely. They are the spine and breadth of the city. They determine light, movement, even time. A forum, a market, a temple, they do not emerge where they please. They are placed like parts of a machine, each one coordinated with the sun's movement, the topography of the earth, and the distance from river or shore. The result is not accidental. It is measured. You still remember kneeling on open ground beside your master, a bowl of polished bronze water at your feet, watching the mirrored stars drift across its surface. He held a stylus suspended above the bowl and said nothing for what felt like hours. Then, with a small nod, he traced a single mark on the edge of the wax tablet, rotated it, and marked another. These were the stars that told him where the sun would rise at equinox. These were the lines that would become streets, not paths of convenience, but decisions. You thought it was magic. Later, you learned it was astronomy. The process is ancient. It predates empire. The Etruscans called it templum, the sacred division of space, into quadrants based on celestial patterns. The Romans absorbed it, refined it, and made it policy. Every new city, from Britain to Judea, begins with augury, with alignment, with the deliberate crossing of invisible lines. You do not build first, you measure. Once the cardo and decumanus are established, the grid unfurls outward. Streets run parallel or perpendicular, forming insula blocks that act like lungs, breathing people in and out of courtyards, shops, homes, and temples. The main intersections widen into public spaces, while narrower lanes slip behind bathhouses and basilicas. Even alleys have rules. They must allow drainage. They must offer light. They must permit the breeze to pass. In Rome, even shadows are regulated. You have spent years walking these cities, measuring them not in distance, but in shadow. You know where the sun will fall at the 6th hour, where a man can walk without burning his feet on midsummer days, where the baker's oven vents will carry heat into streets that cannot afford their own hearth. The city is not a maze, it is a clock. And you, the builder, are the one who winds it. The paving stones beneath your feet tell their own story. They are basalt, heavy and black, polished over time by sandals, carts, and the soft abrasion of time. Each one was placed by hand, each selected not only for shape, but for sound. A badly seated stone will rattle under wheels. A flat one will pool water. A narrow one will invite weeds. You learn to walk these roads with your ears as much as your eyes. Drainage is always your second concern. No Roman road is flat. Each one crowns in the center, then falls away gently to gutters lined with clay pipe and stone trench. These gutters connect, vanish beneath grates, and descend into the great cloacae, the sewers that pulse like dark arteries beneath the city's skin. You must plan the road so that water never rests, for even a single night of standing water can soften the mortar, invite moss, and start the slow rot of decay. When a street fails, it fails first in the shadows. That's where the cracks begin. You once spent 3 months rebuilding a forum street that had collapsed along its eastern gutter. The foundation beneath had shifted because someone long before your time had underestimated the runoff during spring. The water had worn a channel through the fill, eroding the base of the paving until one day, without warning, a section caved in beneath a passing cart. No one died, but the shock was enough to summon the magistrates. You were called, and as you pulled the stones free, you saw it clearly, a dark channel carved by years of disregard. That is how cities die, not in fire, but in neglect. A street must serve many masters. It must allow for the passage of wagons bearing grain and wine. It must absorb the footfall of thousands, from senators to slaves. It must offer rhythm to those who walk barefoot and balance to those who carry water on their shoulders. But beyond all that, it must disappear. It must not call attention to itself. A well-built street becomes invisible. Its success lies in the absence of complaint. You take pride in that silence. There is poetry in the way the streets align with wind. In certain cities, especially along the coast, you measure the breezes before you build. You sit for days, marking the rhythm of air through morning and night. The main roads must not run directly against the wind, or the city will fill with dust and smoke. Instead, you angle them slightly. Let the wind move gently through the grid, cooling it, carrying the scent of the sea, making it livable. Even the noise of the city is shaped by the grid. Sound travels differently along narrow lanes than broad boulevards. You place markets where echoes cannot gather. You widen the intersections where orators speak. You choose paving textures that soften wheels near temples, that slow horses near fountains. You do not simply build streets. You conduct them like instruments. But perhaps the most sacred part of your work comes at dusk, when the sun drops low and the light enters the city, not from above, but along the line of the decumanus. You see it, the golden blade that slices down the center of the street, falling perfectly between columns, passing uninterrupted from gate to gate. It is then you know the alignment is true. The line holds. The city breathes in light. In summer, the shadows shorten and crowd the base of each wall. In winter, they stretch across the road like fingers, but they always fall where you expect them to. That is how you know the city is healthy, not by its temples, not by its palaces, but by its shadows. The people do not notice. They walk beneath those shadows without comment. They cross the streets without thinking. They assume the slope. They ignore the way the paving never puddles. That is your greatest compliment. A street that demands attention has already failed. In time, grass will grow between the stones. Wheels will grind their edges smooth. New builders will raise walls that do not respect your angles. The city will change. But if you have done your work well, the bones will remain. Even beneath layers of time, your lines will endure. Someone digging centuries later will uncover your stones, still aligned, still dry, still faithful to the light. And they will wonder who placed this here, who measured this so precisely that even now, the shadows fall in harmony. They will not know your name, but they will walk your path. You enter through a narrow threshold that reveals nothing. From the outside, the house seems modest, its facade bare, its windows few, its doorway guarded by a wooden lintel that does not boast, only endures. It is not designed to invite the eye. Roman homes do not offer their beauty to the street. They face inward, like secrets, because what matters in these walls is not how you are seen, but how you live. And once you step inside, the world changes. You find yourself in the atrium, the beating heart of the domus. Light spills from an opening above the compluvium, a rectangular void in the roof falling directly onto the shallow basin carved into the floor. The impluvium, which gathers rain and reflects it like a polished mirror. The air here is cool, scented faintly with oil and old marble dust. The echoes are soft, diffused by plastered walls and draped curtains, and for the first time in hours, you feel the space breathe. It is not metaphor. These houses were made to inhale. The Romans, who conquered the known world, were not reckless with their comfort. They designed their homes not only to withstand weather, but to shape it. The walls are thick, not to impose, but to insulate. The ceilings are high, not to impress, but to draw heat away from the body. The courtyard opens not to vanity, but to the sky to allow light, to catch air, to let water speak. The builder begins not with walls, but with the void between them. You know this. You've drawn dozens of atriums, measured their ratios until the numbers became instinct. The width must relate to the height of the surrounding walls. The depth of the basin must balance the amount of rainfall expected in the season. A domus without proportion becomes a box, but with the right calculations, it becomes a vessel. You walk to the impluvium now and crouch beside it. The water within is still, save for the occasional ripple from wind crossing the roofline. You have often watched households live around this basin. Children lean over its edge to watch their faces distort. Slaves dip cloths into it to clean marble thresholds. Old men toss fragments of bread into it, pretending it brings good fortune. But you see something more balance. Above and below, light and depth. This is not ornament. This is design made silent. The rooms spiral outward from the atrium like petals from a center. Cubicula bedrooms with single beds and small chests. Tablinum, the master's office, aligned to the front so business and family never fully separate. Ala, the side wings, which serve no fixed function and often become repositories for memory, busts of ancestors, tablets from past years, faded paintings half restored and half forgotten. You walk through them quietly, tracing your hand along painted plaster. The walls speak of taste, but also of purpose. The pigments vary by region, by wealth, by season. In richer homes, the frescoes imitate architecture false columns, trompe-l'oeil doorways that open into imagined gardens or theatrical landscapes. In simpler homes, the walls are red or ochre, bordered with black or white lines to suggest order. The paint is mixed with lime to bond with the wall, so that the color becomes part of the structure itself. You admire that beauty that cannot peel. Beyond the atrium lies the peristyle, a garden framed by columns, often added later as wealth permitted. Here, the house opens again, not to the street but to itself. The columns are thinner, the roof lower, the mood more contemplative. The light shifts as the day advances, moving in measured steps across the mosaic floors, across the trunks of lemon trees, across the lips of stone fountains shaped like lions or dolphins. You have designed such spaces before, knowing they serve not just for beauty, but for breath. For in Rome, where the days grow hot and the air hangs heavy, a house must exhale. And so, the peristyle is placed to catch breezes. The windows are absent from outer walls, not by accident, but to keep the air pure within, to prevent the dust and stench of the street from seeping in. Ventilation is directed through height, not aperture. Hot air rises, cold air flows low, and the atrium and peristyle together act like lungs, pulling movement where stillness might gather. A Roman house is never truly closed. It inhales light, it exhales warmth. You know this from watching the servants work. In early morning, when the fire has only just been stirred, they move through the house unshod, their footsteps like whispers. They open the inner doors to create cross currents, fan the coals to drive out damp, scatter salt and crushed mint to scent the hallways. A good housekeeper understands what the architect began. She continues it. She observes the air, adjusts the drapery, moves the plants to chase or avoid the sun. You have seen such women work as if performing rites. They do not call it architecture, but they sustain it. At the far end of the house, sometimes tucked behind the peristyle, lies the kitchen. Kalina, cramped, smoky, more functional than beautiful. The floor here is of packed earth or plain brick. The walls are stained with soot, and the ceiling low to trap warmth. You've studied these spaces less, perhaps, but you understand their logic. The heat must be contained, the storage kept dry, the preparation surfaces slightly sloped to ease cleaning. In larger houses, a separate room is built to house slaves. In smaller ones, they sleep in the kitchen, curled beside the stove. That, too, is part of the house's breath fire at the core. And somewhere, perhaps near the tablinum, is the lararium, a small niche or shrine to the household gods, the lares. They are guardians not of fortune or power, but of continuity. They watch over the thresholds, the daily meals, the comings and goings. You often include space for them even when not requested. A house without its gods may be beautiful, but it is not whole. Your task, as builder, is not to glorify the owner. It is to shape a structure that allows life to move freely. Water, light, air, footsteps, breath. Each must have a path. If the doors are placed wrong, the breeze will die. If the atrium is too wide, the light will blind. If the rooms do not connect with rhythm, the servants will grow weary. A house must be a body, with circulation, with lungs, with vision. That is what you were taught. You pause now at the edge of the atrium again, listening to the water shift in the impluvium as a breeze crosses through the opening above. It is a sound you never tire of, not just because it is gentle, but because it confirms that the house is doing what it was made to do. It breathes. Later, once the house is furnished and the family returns, these moments will vanish beneath the clutter of daily life. There will be noise, arguments, laughter, silence. A child will cry, a guest will sing, wine will spill, a mosaic tile will crack beneath a falling amphora, and yet the structure will hold, the lines will remain, the air will still move. That is your triumph, not permanence, but persistence. You think, briefly, of houses left to ruin, of places where no one walks anymore. In Pompeii, before the eruption, you once visited a villa that had been abandoned. The frescoes flaked, the roof collapsed, the impluvium filled with dirt, but the proportions remained, even then. As you stood amid broken statues and shattered glass, you felt the air move in a pattern. The house still breathed, faintly, but truly. And so you understand that architecture is not just the act of building. It is the act of trusting that what you build will continue, even after you are gone. There is a kind of silence that follows the steam. It lingers in the corners of the caldarium, curling around the edge of the stone benches, rising from the tiles in ghost-like ribbons. It is not a silence of absence, but of containment, a quiet forged by heat, by breath, by the ritual of bathing made sacred through repetition. You step into the chamber and the air embraces you not gently, but with weight. The walls are warm to the touch. The ceiling, curved like a shell, traps the heat, sending it downward in slow eddies. This is not merely a bath. It is a temple of the body. But before it could hold the steam, it had to hold the people. You remember the first time you were tasked with designing a therme, not a private bath, not a corner pool behind some wealthy patron's villa, but a true public bathhouse, one that would welcome hundreds each day, each hour, from dawn until well after sunset. The commission came not from a nobleman, but from the city's magistrate, who spoke of civic pride, of health and hygiene, of showing the provinces that Rome's values extended beyond conquest. But what he meant, in truth, was control. A bathhouse keeps people clean. Yes, but also gathered, watched, contained. And so you accepted, with diagrams, calculations, consultations with engineers, and long walks along the edges of land where foundation stones had not yet been laid. The site was chosen for proximity to the aqueduct. That much was obvious, but it also needed access to firewood, space for cisterns, wind protection, shade at certain hours. Sound must be contained. Smells must be managed. A bathhouse is not simply built, it is negotiated. You began, as always, with the path of water. The aqueduct delivers it, but it is not yet ready for use. The water must be collected into cisterns large, lead-lined chambers sunk into the earth, sealed with cement, covered with stone lids heavy enough that they require levers to lift. From there, it is channeled through a complex network of pipes, some heading straight for the frigidarium, others toward the furnaces that will warm the tepidarium and caldarium. Each path must be calculated for flow rate, temperature loss, pressure. Every bend in the pipe creates resistance. Every junction creates delay. And yet the guests who enter will expect immediate satisfaction, a cool basin, a warm bath, a hot plunge all ready at any moment. You supervise the heating system personally. The hypocaust, the subfloor furnace chamber, is the most delicate of all. It is also the most dangerous. The floor of the caldarium must be suspended above the furnace by rows of short brick pillars, each one bearing weight, each one conducting heat. If the floor is too thin, it cracks. If the pillars are misaligned, the heat pools in one place and suffocates the others. If the fire is fed too quickly, the walls buckle. If too slowly, the bath cools and the crowd grows restless. You lay on your stomach for hours in that furnace crawlspace, testing the distribution of heat, watching for flickers in the flame, listening for the pitch of the draw. The slaves who worked the fires respected your presence. They asked no questions. They had seen what happens when heat turns violent. In another city, years ago, you visited a bathhouse where a hypocaust had collapsed during peak hours. The floor above split open with the sound of thunder. 3 men died instantly. The steam finished the rest. When you arrived, the smell was still trapped in the mortar. You scraped a piece of tile from the wall and kept it. As a reminder, fire does not forgive mistakes. After the hypocaust came the domes. The ceilings of the bathhouses cannot be flat. The steam must rise, gather, and condense at points that will not drip directly onto the bathers. You construct the ceilings in a shallow arch, coated with waterproof plaster, painted with celestial scenes, blue skies, winged figures, stars, not merely to delight the eyes, but to keep the mind lifted. In places of nakedness, there must also be beauty. Rome does not allow the public to feel exposed. It demands dignity, even in the water. The baths are divided by purpose, not status. Everyone enters through the same vestibule, passes through the changing rooms, apoditarium where slaves guard clothing, and then chooses their path. The cold bath, the warm bath, the hot bath, the steam room, the massage chamber, the gymnasium. Some stay hours, others minutes. The old men play dice in the shade. The young athletes wrestle on the sand. The merchants gossip. The poets soak in silence. All move through the same sequence of heat and cold, of immersion and release. And yet behind the scenes, the machinery never stops. You once walked the length of the service corridor behind a functioning bath, just after dawn, the fire stoked, the water filling, the pipes vibrating with warmth. The walls of the hypocaust hummed like living things. Slaves moved like shadows feeding furnaces, scrubbing tiles, replacing oil lamps, folding towels. No one sees this part, but without it, the entire illusion fails. The grandeur of the Roman bath is not in its marbled benches or bronze basins. It is in its endurance. A bathhouse must function every day. It must not falter. Clean water, warm air, quiet beauty, all delivered with the same certainty as the sunrise. You made decisions others never noticed. The slope of each floor tile, for example, is a fraction steeper near the corners, so that puddles drain invisibly toward narrow gaps in the wall. The stone benches curve slightly inward, encouraging guests to sit with their legs close, preserving space. The ceiling vents, disguised as decorative grills, open at calculated intervals to allow old steam to escape and fresh air to enter without disrupting the warmth. Every detail matters. The bath must feel effortless, and effortlessness is always the result of precision. You pause now near the frigidarium, watching as cold water shimmers in the morning light. The surface is so still, it appears solid, like glass. You admire this space more than the others. It is quiet here. The voices of the bathers fall lower. The coolness demands introspection. In summer, this is where you would choose to sit. Not for the cold, but for the clarity. Cold water returns the mind to itself. Eventually, the baths will grow crowded. The doorways will echo with laughter, footsteps, sloshing water. The light will strike the steam and scatter into gold, and no one will think of you. No one will recall the hours you spent calculating the radius of the apse, the rate of heat loss through tile, the durability of pipe joints sealed with pitch and linen. They will not remember how many fires had to be tested, how many floors you crawled beneath, how many times you rebuilt the furnace wall by hand because the draw was uneven. But they will return. That is the true measure of a bath. Not its beauty, not its grandeur, but its memory. If people return not because they are told to, not because they are ordered or paid or compelled, but because their body remembers something good, then the bath has succeeded. You have built something that enters the skin, that becomes part of a person's rhythm. And that is what Rome has always understood better than its enemies. That water, properly guided, is not simply hygiene, it is persuasion, it is seduction, it is belonging. You step back into the vestibule, the light now fuller, the heat of the furnace pressing gently against the walls behind you. The baths are beginning to fill. A father and son pass you, speaking softly. A woman adjusts her sandals and follows. You listen to the first splashes, the first sighs, the first murmured greetings of strangers about to become part of the same ritual. And you think of all the invisible hands, those who stoked the fire, who laid the bricks, who sealed the pipe that made this moment possible. The bath holds a crowd, but it holds more than bodies. It holds trust. You pass beneath the rising scaffolds of the temple before the sun has touched the pediment, before the foremen shout their orders or the apprentices stumble in with bundles of tools slung over aching shoulders. The air still smells of wet lime and iron shavings, and in that quiet, when the marble is cool and the dust has not yet begun to stir, you can hear the work of the engineers echoing beneath the sanctity of stone. No one speaks of them once the building is complete. When the final marble slabs are polished, when the steps are swept, and the bronze statues gleam in the full light of noon, the public comes to kneel in awe. They admire the symmetry of columns, the reliefs carved in friezes, the gilded capitals that catch sunlight like crowns. They speak of the gods. They speak of the priesthood. They speak of the money and the power. But they do not speak of the men beneath the floor. And yet it is they who made the miracle stand. You have been one of them, those who draw their measurements in soot on unfinished stone, who crawl through the gaps in the foundations, who lie on their backs beneath half-laid beams, testing stress with the push of a hand and the patience of silence. There is no glory in the substructure. There is only necessity. And sometimes when you are lucky, there is also truth. The temple begins, always, with a platform. Not just any foundation, but one that will outlast argument. Unlike homes or baths, the temples are made to hold permanence, or at least the illusion of it. The weight they carry is not only stone, but belief. And belief has no tolerance for settling, no patience for cracks, no forgiveness for flaws. A shifted column does not indicate misalignment. It becomes blasphemy. A leak in the roof is not carelessness. It is offense to the divine. So the platform must be perfect. You remember kneeling on the packed earth of such a platform before the first course of stone had even been laid. The trench had been dug days before, and the footings arranged. Dry fit, checked, then rechecked under torchlight at dawn. You were called because something was wrong. The measurements did not align, and you found the cause not in the stone, not in the mortar, but in the soil beneath. The earth had absorbed too much water from an underground spring that had not been marked on any survey. The footings had begun to tilt, just enough to make the first course whisper its protest. You ordered the trench dug again, deeper, wider. The magistrate shouted, the priest hissed, but you dug anyway, because temples do not stand on prayers, they stand on soil, and soil, unlike the gods, must be respected through force. When the foundations are at last set, the rising begins. Columns, cella, architrave, and still, your work does not end, because above the visible structure is the hidden armature, the spine of metal and timber that holds the weight in balance. You have walked the length of these understructures, along narrow beams set within the ceilings, your feet leaving prints in sawdust that no one will ever sweep. You have tested the copper clamps that bind marble slabs invisibly, shaped to interlock without a whisper of their presence. You have hammered lead into joints to absorb expansion, to prevent fracture, to silence the sound of shift. You have melted iron, not for weapons, but for stillness. Every step is measured, every adjustment recorded in a book no priest will ever open. But it is the dome that asks the most of you. Not all temples are granted domes. Some are content with flat coffered ceilings, or timbered roofs covered with tile. But those that dare the curve, those that lift their eyes to the heavens and imagine themselves part of it, those require something more than skill. They require trust in geometry. You studied the form for years before you ever attempted to shape one. Not because you doubted its possibility, but because you understood its fragility. A dome is not a roof. It is a floating contradiction, a hemisphere that holds not by force, but by distribution. The weight is pushed outward as much as downward. Each brick or poured layer leans upon the next in a ring of pressure that grows lighter as it ascends. The base must be thick, the crown thin. The mixture of concrete must be adjusted as the curve rises, less stone, more pumice, more void. It is a gradient of gravity, measured in dust. When you finally stood beneath the first dome you helped design, the wooden centering still in place, the scaffold echoing with the creak of ropes and labor, you ran your hand across the inner curve and felt it settle under your skin like a second heartbeat. The geometry was not static. It breathed. It bent. It held. Later, when the centering was removed and the dome remained, you did not cheer. You simply exhaled. Because success in such a structure is not marked by celebration. It is marked by silence. Nothing cracking, nothing falling, nothing betrayed. And beneath that dome, in the shadowed chamber of the cella, you laid the floor. Few know how much matters in a floor. They think only of the pattern, the tesserae arranged in colored mosaics, the inlays of black and red, the motifs that mirror the heavens. But you think of the weight it must carry, the moisture it must resist, the subtle slope it must possess to drain without drawing attention. You think of how a floor must be cool in summer, firm beneath the heel, soft in echo. You choose not just for beauty, but for rhythm, because the temple is not built only to be seen. It is built to be walked. And even more, it is built to be endured. The priests will process in, robed and gilded, swinging incense and reciting lines learned in childhood. They will praise the gods, or pretend to. They will offer sacrifice, or its echo. But it is not they who hold up the ceiling. It is not they who brace the arch. It is not they who know which beam must be replaced in 20 years to prevent collapse. That knowledge rests with you. You have stood in unfinished temples under starlight, brushing dust from plumb lines, watching the breeze move through unglazed windows. You have crouched beneath partially completed pediments while storms passed overhead, calculating the movement of water across stone. You have watched bronze workers pour molten metal into molds shaped from wax and prayer, knowing the slightest flaw would render the seal unfit for the stress it must endure. And when the temple is done, when the walls are painted and the gods installed and the steps swept clean, you will not be invited to the dedication. You will stand beyond the colonnade, watching the flicker of torches, listening to the crowd's murmur, feeling the first hymn rise toward the dome that you helped hold together. You will not mind, because the stones know you. The mortar remembers your touch. The arch rests on your calculation. The dome echoes your silence. And centuries from now, when the paint has faded, when the priests have turned to dust, when new gods have claimed the same space with different names and different rites, the structure will remain. The engineers beneath the temples will never be named, but the temples will still stand. You rise before the traders, before the soldiers, before the sun lifts its first finger over the hills, before the mules snort at the frost and the carts creak their first reluctant complaint. The road is already alive, not with footsteps or wheels or the weight of passing commerce, but with memory. It is cold underfoot and damp with dew. Yet there is an undeniable presence in its silence, as if the stones themselves are waiting, prepared, aware that within moments they will carry 1,000 lives again. You pause on the shoulder of the Via Appia, where the embankment rises gently to meet the horizon, and you look not at the travelers, not at the milestones, not at the landscape unrolling before you like a scroll, but at the road itself. It does not sleep. It never has. The Roman road is not merely a line drawn across terrain. It is a declaration of intention, of order, of reach. It connects the edge of empire to its heart. It binds garrison to garrison, sea to city, province to principle. And unlike rivers or winds, it does not shift with seasons. It does not bend for rain. It remains, in all weather, under all rulers, through peace and riot, as dependable as breath. You have built such roads. You have walked them in every season. You have sketched their gradients in chalk and carved their markers in stone. And you know that their greatness lies not in their surface, but in their depth. A Roman road begins not with paving, but with excavation. You dig deep agar. They call it the embanked foundation of the roadbed. The earth must be removed down to the hard layer, sometimes 3 or 4 feet deep, until no roots or rot remain, until the soil resists your heel. Into this trench, layers are poured first, the statumen large, fist-sized stones, irregular but locked together like puzzle pieces. Upon this, the rudus, a mix of gravel, lime, and clay, beaten down until it is compact and unyielding. Then comes the nucleus, a finer mix, almost a mortar, smoothed to near flatness. Only then, only after these hidden layers are settled, aligned, compressed, and dried, do you lay the final surface, the summum dorsum. The paving stones are often basalt or other volcanic rock, dark, heavy, resistant to water and wear. They are cut irregularly, but their placement is no accident. Each is tested by hand, laid with space for expansion, with channels for drainage, with curvature to shed water into the ditches that run alongside. You do not pave in straight lines unless the land permits. Even the flat road must rise slightly at its center. Even the straight road is full of thought. When the road nears a town, it widens, not only to accommodate the increase in traffic, but because the road becomes a space of display. Monuments cluster near the entrance. Tombs line the shoulders. Vendors set up stalls. Processions begin here. And so the road itself transforms from tool to theater, from function to presence. You have designed these transitions carefully. They must not feel abrupt. The road must seem to evolve, like a breath drawing in before it speaks. But out in the open land, between cities and ports, between rivers and walls, the road returns to its essential form, a thread through wilderness. And it is there, away from the crowds, that you feel most connected to the builders who came before you. They had no compasses as you have. They measured distance with chains and shadows. They consulted the stars and the slope of hills. They carved through rock, filled marshes, built bridges where rivers had no ford. They were not always paid. Some were slaves. Some were veterans granted plots of land. But they laid stone as if the empire depended on it, because it did. You once walked 100 miles along the Via Egnatia, crossing from the Adriatic into Macedonia, and at each interval, you found their marks, small chisels etched into the corner of a slab, the barely visible groove that told of alignment, the stake hole filled with dust and moss. They were there, even when gone. The road held them, and so it holds you. You have heard it said that all roads lead to Rome. It is not merely a phrase. It is engineering. The cursus publicus, the imperial post, moves faster than any private caravan because the roads are planned for continuity. Way stations mutationes dot the route, offering fresh horses, supplies, shelter. Milestones mark every 1,000 paces. No one gets lost on a Roman road unless they mean to. You know this because you have walked them at night. You remember one such night, a return from an inland project, alone. The moon sharp overhead. The road lay silver beneath your feet, silent except for the rustle of dry grass and your own footsteps. And though the forest pressed in close, though the shadows twisted between trees, the stones did not waver. The line held, the path endured, and you felt, more than saw, that you were not the first to pass this way in darkness, and you would not be the last. That is the quiet genius of the Roman road. It teaches you not to fear distance. You have seen armies march upon it, dust rising in plumes behind columns of men. You have seen convoys of grain, oil, and amphora roll through in steady rhythm, wheels thudding against stone, mules grunting under straps. You have seen the sick carried on litters, the dead carried on stretchers, the newly married led barefoot under banners. The road takes them all. It does not discriminate. It only receives. It receives the soldier with his sword. It receives the mother with her child. It receives the exile, the merchant, the thief, the builder. All tread the same path, all wear down the same stone, and over time, the road does not fade, it deepens. Its grooves become signatures. Its wear becomes memory. It does not erode, it records. You once had the chance to rebuild a section outside the old walls of Tarentum, where a landslide had buried a mile-long stretch. The excavation took weeks. The mud had dried into layers so dense they had to be chipped away like old plaster. When you reached the original paving, you found it intact. The grooves of chariot wheels were still visible. Beneath one stone, pressed into the dirt, lay a child's copper ring bent, forgotten, untaken by time. You left it there. The road, you believed, had already chosen to keep it. People believe roads are for travel. You know better. They are for return. Every road you build, you measure not only in distance, but in trust. The trust that the road will be there tomorrow, that it will not crumble under storm or sink beneath the weight of years, that it will guide, that it will hold. And when the empire is gone, when the banners have been folded, when the laws have been rewritten, when the cities have fallen to other names, some roads will remain. They may be cracked, overgrown, but they will still point, still lead, still endure. The wall stretches before you, tall, simple, unadorned. No arch breaks its rhythm. No statue crowns its height. No carved inscription announces its purpose. It is not a monument. It is not a temple. It does not dazzle. And yet, as you walk alongside it in the early light, hand grazing the sun-warmed surface, you know that this wall holds more than stone. It holds memory, because embedded in its very bones, pressed faintly into hundreds of the rectangular blocks that form its frame, are names, not of gods, not of senators, not of emperors, but of the men who made the bricks. You pause before one, a narrow red clay rectangle among hundreds, indistinguishable at first glance. But when your shadow moves aside and the light strikes it cleanly, the faint curve of letters emerges stamped into the clay while it was still wet. It reads L. Petilius Felix, Figlina Veronis, the name of the man, the kiln, the place. You have seen thousands of such stamps, and yet each time you encounter one, it stops you, because it reminds you that long before the wall stood tall, there was earth beneath the fingernails of a man who shaped it. Rome is built not only on marble and ambition, but on clay, fired and cooled, stamped and stacked. It rises across the empire with quiet consistency. And while emperors declare their triumphs in bronze, the bricklayers whisper theirs in kilns. They do not ask to be remembered, but they leave their mark. The process begins far from the city, in the lowlands where clay can be dug with minimal resistance. The best comes from riverbeds soft, rich, heavy with sediment. It is not simply extracted, but selected. Too coarse, and the brick will crack in drying. Too fine, and it will not hold its form. The clay is gathered in carts, brought to the Figlina, the brickyard, where it is trampled, wetted, kneaded like dough. It is shaped in molds, sometimes by hand, sometimes with wooden frames, then laid out to dry in the sun for several days. Only once the surface is firm are the bricks loaded into a kiln. But before that, they are stamped. The stamp is not ornamental. It is administrative. It records ownership, origin, date. Sometimes it includes the name of the estate that owns the land, sometimes the overseer of the yard, sometimes the name of the dominus himself. Rarely, it bears the mark of the worker. More often, it is the mark of power. But in the folds of imperial bureaucracy, those marks become time's bookmarks. and to you, the builder, the planner, the one who must transform piles of fired clay into living structure, they become something else entirely, a ledger of forgotten labor. You remember visiting a brickyard outside Ostia, where the stamps were applied with such regularity that they blurred into patterns. A boy no older than 10 stood beside a stack, a wooden paddle in his hand, pressing the same name into each brick with solemn rhythm. You asked him if he knew whose name he carried. He shook his head, but he pressed it again, without pause. It was not his task to understand the name, only to repeat it. Once the bricks are fired stacked in domed kilns fed with pine and olive wood, the heat maintained over days, the temperature rising until the clay sings, they are ready to build. They arrive in carts drawn by oxen, stacked in bundles of 50, smelling faintly of smoke, their edges still bearing the soft dust of the brickyard. You sort them first by size, then by purpose. Flat bricks for flooring, thick ones for vaulting, curved for pipes, narrow for partition walls. The dimensions vary, but their soul remains the same. What surprises most outsiders is how much of Rome is brick. The marble is a skin. Beneath it lies fired clay. The temples wear stone to impress, but are framed in brick. The bathhouses gleam with mosaic, but their vast domes rest on brick walls many feet thick. Even the palaces, with their columns and bronze, are anchored in brick. You have climbed the scaffolds behind the basilicas and run your fingers along the hidden layers. You have felt the difference in temperature where brick retains warmth. You have heard the hollow echo it gives when tapped. You know its weight, its sound, its patience. Brick is honest. It does not pretend to eternity. It chips, it cracks, it weathers, but it holds. You learned long ago how to read it. A well-fired brick gives off a dull ring when struck. A weak one sounds flat. A broken edge can be salvaged if placed at a corner or interior joint. You do not waste material unless it threatens structure. There is pride in using what survives the kiln, even if imperfect. Some builders reject the chipped. You do not. You believe the empire is made stronger by what endures despite flaw. Mortar is the companion to the brick lime mixed with pozzolana. Sand, sometimes ground brick itself. You spread it evenly, never too thick, too much, and the wall becomes soft. Too little, and the voids welcome water. You press each brick with care, not with force, aligning by string, checking by eye, tapping it with a trowel's handle until it settles into place, with the sound you have come to recognize, not a thud, not a clatter, but a certain softness that says the bond is right. As you build, the stamps disappear, covered by plaster, paint, stucco, buried in interior walls, hidden behind marble veneers, but you know they are there. You remember them. You've touched them. When others speak of the building's beauty, you think of the man who pressed that name into the wet clay before the sun rose too high. You think of the fire that cured the brick, the cart that bore it, the hand that passed it to yours. And sometimes, when you know the wall will be sealed forever, when no eye will see the inner surface again, you pause and place one brick with the stamp facing inward, but uncovered. A message, perhaps a gesture, a secret witness. Not for glory, not for pride, but so that one day, if the wall is broken open, someone might see it and know this building was made by many hands. In a city of emperors, it is easy to forget that the empire is built by those whose names are never spoken aloud. You once rebuilt a collapsed section of warehouse wall near the river. The structure was unremarkable plain, functional, built for grain storage. But in dismantling the ruined portion, you discovered layer upon layer of stamped bricks, Some bore names you recognized from estate records. Others were unfamiliar. A few bore only initials. One pressed lightly, as if with the last breath of a fading effort, read simply Marius. No origin, no estate, just the name. You kept that brick, not to display, but to remember. Because you know, better than most, that buildings do not rise from drawings alone. They rise from repetition, from labor, from the steady rhythm of men pressing one shape into another until something larger takes form. And each of those shapes carries not just weight, but will. The next time you walk the city through its alleys, its palaces, its forums, pause when you see a wall of quiet brick. Look closely. You may not see the name. It may be hidden, covered, forgotten. But it is there, stamped in clay, fired by flame, laid by hand, built to bear. Not just the city, but the memory of those who gave it shape. It begins with smoke. Not the dramatic billowing clouds of theater or battle, but the thin, silent kind that slips through cracks and dances between rafters, unnoticed until it is already too late. You've smelled it before, sweet and acrid, like pine pitch and old cloth, curling from a corner beam where someone forgot to bank the coals before sleep. It is not loud. It does not ask for attention, but it devours everything with equal hunger. Rome is no stranger to fire. The city, with its layers and layers of wood and dust and proximity, its oil lamps left burning, its kitchens pressed too tightly to timber, its braziers glowing unattended through the night, has burned before and will burn again. You've seen the maps, not of conquest, but of damage. Charred districts, entire insula reduced to skeletons, storehouses gone, temples cracked, walls blackened until they wept powder. The fires move faster than commands, faster than reason. They leap roofs, cross alleys, and turn architecture into ash. And so, for the builder, fire is not a possibility. It is an expectation, one you must account for long before it arrives. You've spent more hours planning against fire than for rain or wind, because rain waits, wind hesitates, fire simply takes. The first defense is in the walls. A proper Roman wall is not a single thickness of brick or stone, but a composite, a breathing structure of layers. You begin with opus caementicium, the concrete core poured into wooden frames, made of lime, pozzolana, water, and crushed stone. Around it, a skin, sometimes brick, sometimes ashlar masonry tied into the core with metal clamps or brick headers. These layers, when properly bound, do more than support. They resist heat. Concrete, dense and without gaps, delays fire's advance. It does not burn. It does not feed the flame. But structure alone is not enough. Roofs are your greatest vulnerability. Timber beams, dried by sun and time, can ignite in seconds. Even a spark from a nearby forge, carried on a careless breeze, can find a roof and begin its slow, invisible conquest. And so, you choose your materials with care. Tiles, not thatch. Terracotta, not pitch. Where possible, you space the joists farther apart to prevent the spread. You coat the beams with lime wash, not because it is beautiful, but because it slows the burn. In wealthier districts, you build fire breaks into the street plan alleys too wide for flames to leap, walls of stone that absorb heat and deny passage. Still, nothing resists entirely. That is why you focus on containment. You learn to build like a physician, learning to stop a fever from spreading. In insulae apartment blocks, where the poor live, stacked like amphorae, you segment the floors. Each unit has a thick dividing wall, sometimes even a slab of pumicecrete, above the ceiling to delay the rise of heat. Staircases are shifted to the front of buildings, not buried in the center, so that when fire comes, there is a chance to flee. You widen the courtyards, however slightly, so that air may draw the flame upward, not outward. You design traps for it, without ever naming them as such. You know how fire moves. It breathes like a thing alive. It looks for weakness, and so you deny it. You recall walking through the ruins of a tenement that had burned the year before a cluster of rooms near the Subura, where the walls had been blackened from floor to lintel. The upper floors had collapsed. The stairwell was nothing but melted iron and collapsed plaster. But there, in the rear corner, one wall still stood, not untouched but standing. The reason, you found, was not a miracle, but a layer of crushed tile and lime that had been packed between the bricks years ago during a hasty repair. It had slowed the fire just enough. A child had survived in that room. You saw her later, sitting among the rubble, her face wrapped in linen, her eyes wide and unblinking. You remembered that wall, you sketched it, and you began to use that same mixture in your own constructions, not as innovation, but as memory. Public buildings demand even more discipline. The baths, the basilicas, the granaries each contains its own fire hazards. The hypocaust systems, with their constant furnaces, are both miracle and threat. You walk beneath the raised floors, checking the flues, testing the temperature of the walls with the back of your hand. You instruct your apprentices to watch for the change in plaster color white to yellow, yellow to red. That's the sign. That's when the wall is beginning to fail. That's when you tear it down, not later. In the granaries, you make different decisions. The walls are high and narrow, the windows small and placed to limit light, not to protect the grain from sun, but from heat. You line the floors with tile. You raise the storage jars off the ground. You build fire wells in the courtyard not to draw water, but as emergency reservoirs. These are not grand gestures. No statue will be erected in your name for these precautions, but they are what preserve the empire when chaos comes. Fire, you know, is not only an enemy, it is also a tool. You've used it yourself, in the kiln, in the furnace, in the forge. You've shaped lime with it. You've cured stone. You've tempered iron and brought dull clay to vibrant red. You respect fire. You do not hate it. You study it, the way one studies language. It is not wild. It is precise if you understand it, if you listen. That's why, in the great temples, you treat fire differently. You guide it in the sacred hearths, in the altars, in the ceremonial flames. You do not build to resist fire, you build to frame it. The Vestal Temple holds its central flame without flinching, because you shaped its basin with volcanic rock and encased its support structure in layers of sealed brick. You placed the opening above to draw smoke and the vents below to feed oxygen. You made the fire seem eternal, not by magic, but by mathematics. The fire remains because you told it where to stay. And in that act, you realize something deeper. That fireproofing the empire is not about denying the existence of fire. It is about understanding that every city, every building, every moment of peace carries within it the potential for collapse. That a single mistake, an unclean chimney, a careless lamp, a spark can undo centuries. That permanence is not achieved by pretending the danger is gone, but by accepting it and planning for its inevitable arrival. That is why, in your designs, you always include the unseen. You allow for hidden stairways. You widen doors that lead to courtyards. You build rooftops with access points, not for maintenance, but for escape. You whisper to the owners, quietly, to store a jug of water on the second floor. You ensure that even in beauty, there is resistance. Because when the fire comes, and it will come, it will not care how noble the cause, or how fine the art. It will not pause at gold. It will not hesitate at prayer. But if you have built well, if you have thought ahead, then perhaps the fire will find no breath to feed it. Perhaps it will starve. Perhaps the people will live. And perhaps no one will even notice. Because the greatest triumph in fireproofing is not in stopping the fire, but in making sure that when it comes, the structure holds quietly, completely, without spectacle. And when the smoke clears, and the embers die, and the walls still stand, the city will not thank you, but it will still be there. You arrive before the crowd does, when the only sound is the wind brushing past the arches, and the distant clatter of wooden carts unloading crates of sand, rope, and rusted iron. The amphitheater still sleeps. Its shadows are deep. Its echo is empty. Yet even in silence, it feels awake. There is something in its shape that defies rest, a tension woven into the curves, a hunger carved into its tears. You stand at the base of the outer wall and tilt your head slowly upward, letting your gaze follow the rhythm of stone as it rises, arch after arch, like teeth in a jaw too vast to close. This is not a place built to be beautiful. It was built to hold sound and blood, and thousands of eyes trained on the same single point. You were told, when you first joined the crew assigned to its expansion, that this was an honor, that working on an amphitheater, especially one this large, meant being part of something imperial, something visible, something eternal. You smiled politely, then packed your tools and followed the crew south. But in truth, you knew better. This was not a monument. This was a machine, a structure designed for control. Because the amphitheater is not only a space for sport, it is a ritual of hierarchy. Every detail, every archway, stairwell, corridor, and tier is calculated not for beauty, but for movement, for containment, for separation, for surveillance. The rich are elevated above the poor, not just in wealth, but in vantage. The senator sees what the slave cannot. The priest walks where the merchant is denied. And yet, despite these divisions, all eyes still converge on the same circle of sand. That is where the empire reveals itself, in concentric power, in controlled violence, in applause that is permission and silence that is sentence. You learned the mathematics of this long before you stepped inside one. The seating cavea is tiered not just for view, but for acoustics. The curve must be precise, too shallow, and the roar of the crowd will scatter into the open sky, too steep, and the weight of the audience becomes a threat to the outer wall. You must balance pressure, sound, and sight. The vomitoria, those wide, terrifying passages that release crowds like floodgates, must be numerous, but also invisible from the center. The audience should feel that they arrive from nowhere, that they vanish into stone. You have walked those tunnels. You know their length, their darkness, their breath. The materials must carry more than weight. They must carry resonance, concrete forms, the bones poured into massive molds, mixed with ash and broken stone, tamped and set in layers to resist the swelling pressure of thousands shifting at once. Brick shapes the curves, its predictable texture allowing speed and symmetry. Travertine clads the face not only for show, but for heat resistance and erosion control. Iron clamps bind the stones together, buried deep inside where no eye will see, but every tremor will test. And in the center, the arena, a flat ellipse of packed sand overlaying a complex labyrinth of cells, lifts, and corridors. Beneath that surface, lies a second world, and you have descended into it. You remember the cold? Even on the hottest days, the hypogeum remains damp and shadowed. It stretches in corridors and chambers beneath the stage, where slaves work in darkness, oiling the mechanisms that raise cages and platforms through trapdoors timed to open on cue. You studied those pulleys, wooden wheels reinforced with bronze, their ropes oiled with pig fat, their channels grooved deep from repetition. The trapdoors are counterweighted, the lifts silent when raised slowly, violent when forced. You touched the underside of the stage and felt it tremble from rehearsal above. You listened to the echo of voices practicing death. That is where the amphitheater begins in fear. Not yours, perhaps, not directly, but the fear of being seen, of being chosen, of being offered to the crowd. The architecture amplifies that fear. The gate through which the gladiators enter Porta Sana Vivaria is wide and sunlit, but the corridors behind it are narrow, curved, disorienting. They are designed to delay, to confuse, to contain breath until the sudden, blinding release into open sand. You know this. You helped measure them. You once traced the dimensions of a holding pen and realized it had no true corner, only curves, designed so no man could brace himself. Everything in the lower levels is built to prevent control. The building dominates those within it. That is its function. And yet, above the sand, it reverses. The audience controls, or at least believes they do. Their voices rise in unison, a wave that begins low and builds into a single, thundering wall of sound. You have stood in the rafters while the crowd filled the arena. You have felt the vibration of applause before hearing it. It moves through the bones of the building, not merely the air. The amphitheater is a drum. It sings of power, and the people stacked and separated, divided yet together, feel that power as their own. That is the brilliance. The building makes them complicit. You remember the day of an inaugural hunt, 100 beasts released into the arena, imported from distant corners of empire. Lions, bears, ostriches, deer, panthers. They were meant to be exotic, to show the reach of Roman arms. But the cages malfunctioned. 2 lions refused to leave their cells. The trapdoor jammed. The mechanism, one of your own, had warped after weeks of disuse and sudden humidity. You spent the entire event beneath the arena, hammering in a chamber filled with the smell of blood and straw. No one saw you, but the beasts eventually emerged. The crowd roared. The emperor smiled. You fixed the failure before it was noticed. That, too, is part of the amphitheater's design. The truth of its function is hidden. Its flaws are buried. Its precision is masked by spectacle. You've walked the outer walls and seen how the arches align, not randomly, but with purpose. They frame the city beyond like paintings in motion. Each entrance is measured not only in width, but in shadow. The morning sun pours into the eastern corridors, warming the seats reserved for dignitaries. The western sun sets behind the awning supports, keeping the outer tiers cool. This is not art. It is control disguised as comfort. The velarium, that massive canvas canopy stretched across the upper tiers, is an engineering marvel in itself. You once spent an entire summer measuring wind direction from the top ring of an unfinished amphitheater, watching flags and cloth strips flutter with barely perceptible motion. The ropes that hold the canopy must be angled precisely to compensate for wind shear. The masts are embedded into the stone with reinforced sockets. The rigging is operated by sailors, not laborers, because the canopy behaves like a sail. It catches more than shade. It catches risk. One failure in tension, and the entire roof can collapse. You have seen it happen, once, in a lesser city. The aftermath was quiet only because the dead could no longer speak. And yet, the amphitheater is beloved, because it offers not safety, but release. Not peace, but catharsis. The people come not to be comforted, but to feel the edge. The architecture understands this. It does not soothe. It exhilarates. It does not conceal its violence. It sanctifies it. You, who have measured its angles, tested its arches, climbed its scaffold and descended into its substructures, carry a strange kind of reverence for it. Not admiration, not affection, but recognition. You know what it takes to keep this machine breathing. You know how easily it can fail, and you know that if it does, no one will blame the building. They will blame those who fell. That, too, is by design. When the crowd empties, when the blood is washed away with buckets and straw, when the sun begins to set and the arches glow orange in the last of the light, you walk the perimeter one last time. You listen for the creak of tension in the upper masts. You check the seams of the stone where the pressure of thousands has pushed its weight again and again. You make notes. You sketch repairs. You do not seek praise. You do not wait for applause. Because you understand what the amphitheater is. It is not simply a place where the empire entertains itself. It is where the empire reveals itself. You arrive before the others, as always, with a wax tablet tucked beneath your arm and a stylus already worn from weeks of corrections. The ground is still damp from last night's fog, and your sandals press shallow prints into soil that has not yet hardened into dust. This is where the building will rise, though no stone has yet been laid, and no pillar yet cast a shadow. There are no blueprints. There is only you, the earth, and the light. And this is enough, because before Roman architecture becomes form, it must become thought, and thought, in your world, is not something etched in ink or traced on parchment. It is drawn in sand, in lime dust, in gestures made by hand across the soil, erased and redrawn again and again, until the proportions feel right, until the balance feels inevitable. It is a process of patience and presence. You do not build from paper. You build from understanding. The Greeks, you've been told, preferred perfection. They carved their measurements into marble, mapped geometry with cold, unwavering certainty. But the Romans build to endure, not to idealize. And to endure means adapting to the land, to the slope of the hill, to the mood of the soil. You do not simply replicate a design. You negotiate it. You begin with lines, not ink, but cord, thin twine, dipped in charcoal, stretched taut between two pins hammered gently into the ground. You pluck the line and release. It snaps down, leaving a black mark across the surface. One stroke, then another. Slowly, the footprint of the building begins to emerge, not as a drawing, but as a presence beneath your feet. There is no audience, no crowd to cheer the first line. No ceremony for this part of the work. And yet, you take more care here than in almost any other moment, because the line you draw in sand now will become a wall in stone tomorrow. If it is off by the width of a finger, the building will feel crooked. Light will fall wrong. Water will pool where it shouldn't. Rooms will echo strangely. Every mistake begins here quiet, almost invisible, and only later reveals itself in the strain of a beam or the warping of a stair. So you walk the line again. You adjust the angle. You remeasure the width. You make the correction before the stone has the chance to lock the error in place. The outline completed, you begin shaping space. Not with walls, but with poles and stakes. You set them at the corners of future rooms, then stretch string between them to define thresholds. You walk from the front entrance to the inner chamber, measuring with steps. You pause in the center and ask yourself, does this feel right? Not mathematically, but humanly. Does it feel like it will hold sound, hold shadow, hold silence? These are questions no drawing can answer. And so you let the answers rise from the ground itself. Lime dust is sprinkled to preserve the lines. You mix it with sand to mark permanent edges. Tamp it gently into the soil. The powder settles into grooves where water once ran, settles into cracks in the earth, makes visible the invisible rules that will soon become structure. You feel, at times, less like a builder and more like a scribe recording what the earth itself has dictated, transcribing into geometry what already existed as tension, as flow. There are tools, of course levels, compasses, weighted cords, but they are not rulers. They are instruments of listening. The groma helps you mark right angles. Yes, but it also teaches you patience. A careless gust of wind, a shift in your stance, even a cough at the wrong moment can distort your mark. So you breathe. You steady your hand. You wait. No one teaches this. They teach how to cut stone, how to mix pozzolana, how to build arches and lift columns, but not how to stand still, not how to feel when the proportions of a room are quietly wrong, not how to know when a corridor is too narrow, even if the measurements say it should be wide enough. These things you learn only by drawing and redrawing, by watching the dust settle differently each morning, by standing in spaces that don't yet exist and trying to feel if they will want to be lived in. Once, years ago, you were called to correct a shrine whose roof would not settle. The builders had followed the plan perfectly. The angles were correct. The walls were true. But the roof pressed awkwardly, resisting its own weight. The beams groaned. The doors refused to close. You arrived at dusk and walked the space. No one interrupted you. You said nothing. You waited until the sky darkened, and the wind moved differently through the open walls. Then you found it a wall, misaligned by only a fraction, an axis off by a single degree, enough to disrupt the breath of the building. You marked it with lime, and the next day, they rebuilt it. That shrine stands still. That is the power of these early lines, not their sharpness, but their honesty. The apprentices do not yet understand this. They ask you to draw faster, to finish the layout so they can begin digging. But you do not rush this part. You tell them this is when the building is still dreaming. Once the trenches are dug, the decisions cannot be undone. But now, with only chalk and string and air, anything can still be made right. Sometimes you kneel beside the lines and run your fingers across the dirt, smearing the edge of a curve to make it softer. You change the shape of a niche by an inch. You shift a column closer to the path of morning sun. These changes are not arbitrary. They come from years of watching how light enters rooms, how sound collects in corners, how warmth clings to plaster or flees from stone. The building does not begin when the stones arrive. It begins now, with your hands in the dust. And when the client arrives, usually late, surrounded by servants and heavy with gold, you smile and step aside, letting him admire the open field and the faint white lines cutting through it. He does not understand them. Not fully. He sees shapes, perhaps even grace, but not the labor they conceal, not the decisions already made. You explain gently. You trace a path from entrance to atrium to garden. He nods. He says it is exactly as he imagined. You know that's not true, but you let him believe it. Because if he knew how many times you erased and redrew the corridor to avoid the summer glare, how many hours you spent debating whether the doorway should frame the tree or the fountain, how often you stood in the dark alone, asking whether the wind would carry too sharply across the dining floor, He might not understand, but the building will later, when the walls rise, when the tiles are laid, when the frescoes begin to take shape. You will still remember this version, the one written in sand and air, in instinct and doubt. You will remember the way the wind moved across the site that first morning, the shape the chalk made when it snapped, the quiet. That memory is your true blueprint. It will not survive on paper. It will not be copied. It exists only in you. And when others walk the halls and praise the beauty of the arches, the logic of the layout, the comfort of the space, you will nod and say nothing of the moment you stood in the field, alone, and changed a line by 2 fingers' width, because that change saved the building, because that change gave it breath. You do not carry many tools, not because your work is simple, but because the most powerful instruments you rely on cannot be held. The Roman builders' genius was never in the quantity of their tools, but in their clarity tools that worked with the mind, not instead of it. You step onto the site with a satchel that rattles gently against your hip string, chalk, a plumb bob, a folding ruler of ivory segments, and a wax tablet for marking numbers that might vanish before the day is done. And yet, with these few items, entire cities have risen. There is no forge, no mechanical drafting table, no great invention of brass or bronze humming with gears. There is geometry, there is intuition, and there is repetition made sacred through memory. Your most constant companion is the libra, the level. At first glance, it is nothing more than a small beam of wood with a string and weight hanging from its center, a triangle that catches the eye like a child's toy. But place it on a surface, and the string will cut the air like judgment. The plumb line does not flatter. It has no patience for excuses. It tells the truth with gravity, and you have learned to obey it. Not all surfaces that seem flat are true. Not all lines that feel even are honest. The Libra does not care how tired you are, how late the day has grown, or how confident the bricklayer appears. If the thread drifts off center, you stop. You do not argue with it. You adjust. And then you test again. It is this humility that separates the master from the apprentice. You remember one morning in Ostia, high above the docks, trying to align a row of arches that had sagged by less than a finger's width. To the casual observer, the deviation was invisible, but the arc of the arches would create a rhythm through the cloister, a musicality in shadow and light. A single misalignment unseen today would become glaring once the sun traced its full path. You placed the Libra against each keystone, corrected the angle, repositioned the scaffold. The crew grumbled. The client grew impatient. But when it was finished, and the light moved across the curve like water across a basin, no one questioned the extra days you spent. They simply said it felt right. That is what the tools are for, not just precision, but grace. The chorobates, your largest and perhaps most majestic tool, is a beast of beams and channels. A surveying level 5 meters long, balanced on supports and filled with water. Where the plumb line cannot reach, the water finds truth. You built one yourself, using cedar and bronze. You remember spending half a week just ensuring the surface was smooth enough for the water to rest without ripple. A single imperfection would betray the entire measure. With the chorobates, you lay aqueducts. Not roads, not floors, not temples, but rivers in the sky. And rivers demand obedience. They do not lie for pride or for politics. Water flows only where slope permits, and your job is to command it with angles so shallow, so precise, that the eye cannot see the descent. 1 part in 100, 1 palm for every 100 steps. The tool shows you where the water will go, and if the water disobeys, you do not curse the tool, you curse yourself. That is the danger of using thought as a tool. When it fails, there is no one to blame but the hand that wielded it. You carry compasses and calipers, but they are not used as the Greeks used them for ideal shapes, for sacred triangles and endless proofs. You use them for tension, for proportion, for the quiet balance between base and capital, between window and cornice. You know that the eye notices imbalance long before it understands why. So the compasses open like wings over the parchment or the plaster, checking nothing as absolute, but everything as relational. The column is not tall on its own. It is tall only when the wall is low. The window is not large unless the ceiling is narrow. The statue is not centered unless the corridor guides you to pause. And so your compasses trace curves not just to measure, but to listen, to ask the building what it needs, to compare, to echo, to restate in form what began as a whisper. Then there is the square, your most stubborn, most reliable companion, wood and bronze. It fits in your hand and on your belt. It finds truth in corners. You use it not just to build, but to test. Test the edge of a stone slab. Test the meeting of two walls. Test the soul of a craftsman. You once gave it to a new apprentice and watched as he used it wrong for 2 days, measuring against the stone's edge instead of its heart. You said nothing. And on the 3rd day, when his column leaned just enough to shame him, he understood. The tool cannot guide if the hand refuses to be guided. Still, you know that even the best tools can become a crutch. So you remind yourself, always, that the most essential tool is your body, your hands, your eyes, your breath. You measure the height of a wall by pacing, the rhythm of a space by heartbeat. You hold the weight of a stone before marking its place, not just to test your strength, but to let its density inform you. You feel the shift of balance when you stand beneath a half-finished arch, not with a gauge, but with your spine. The tools help, but it is your body that knows when the wall might fall, when the curve might crack. That is why the most respected builders in Rome are not always the most educated. They are the most embodied. They carry the sight in their joints. They speak not in diagrams but in gesture. They build with rhythm more than rule. This is why Roman engineering excels not only in invention, but in endurance, because it is built by bodies who live in the world they raise, not machines, not theories, but hands calloused, sun-scarred, and cautious. Even your wax tablet, that humble slate you carry in a leather case, is more tool of reflection than record. You jot down no formulas, only ratios, ideas, reminders. Increase the arch radius by 1/6, widen corridor to ease echo. Light fails after the 3rd hour, rotate window axis. These are not orders. They are thoughts waiting to be tested. The wax softens in your pocket. The letters smear if pressed too hard. It is a gentle, almost human medium. It teaches you not to declare, but to wonder. And above all, there is silence. The silence you cultivate when laying stone. The pause before hoisting a lintel. The quiet moment before drawing a final line in chalk. Knowing that this line, unlike all the ones before it, will be made in stone. You stand, you breathe, you wait. You look not only with your eyes, but with your memory. You ask the building what it wants. Then you draw. This, too, is a tool. Listening, slowness, the willingness to wait until the right thought arrives. You have worked beside men who rushed, who measured twice and still missed the mark, who trusted only their eyes. Their buildings still stand, but they do not breathe. You know the difference, because your tools are not made only of bronze and wood. They are made from thought, and thought is quiet. It does not boast. It does not shine. It does not demand to be seen. But it endures in the curve of a vault that has not cracked, in the slope of a stair that welcomes the tired, in the silence of a hall that makes strangers speak softly. And long after your name is forgotten, your tools will still be speaking through stone, through shadow, through space. It begins not with the crane, but with the decision to lift. A stone lies before you, twice the height of a man, shaped and dressed, but still rooted to the earth. It has been hauled here by oxen and men across muddy roads and sun-baked bridges. It has waited under canvas for a week, as the site was readied, as the ropes were checked, as the sky was watched for wind. Now it waits for you. The lifting of a Roman stone is not a simple task of hoisting weight. It is a ceremony of force and precision. You cannot shout at a stone to rise. You cannot will it upward with speed or anger. The stone must be invited. And for that, you need leverage. You step around it with slow steps, tracing its edges, checking the iron clamps already fixed into the anchor holes. These are the Lewis irons, inserted like teeth into sockets carved with care. When tension rises, the metal will bite into the weight, holding it fast. If inserted wrongly or cut carelessly, the stone will shift mid-air or worse, fall. You have seen what happens when it falls. Not just the breaking of limestone or the snapping of ropes, but the silence afterward. The kind that makes men look away. The kind that reminds everyone that gravity never forgives. And so, before anything rises, you speak to the team. You remind them of every motion of which rope to pull first, of who watches the pivot, of where to stand if the arm creaks or sags. You tell them to breathe through the lift, not to grunt or panic. You ask them to listen to the crane. Because the polyspaston is more than timber and twine. It is an extension of your will, a vertical arm of pine, strengthened by iron plates, rigged with compound pulleys, standing like a quiet sentinel beside the foundation trench. Its arms are weathered smooth from use. Its ropes smell of sweat, tallow, and summer sun. You do not shout, you raise your hand. At first, the motion is almost imperceptible. A slow tightening of the ropes, a creak from the winch, a ripple through the scaffolding. The stone does not rise quickly. It tilts, it resists, it tests your alignment. If one pulley strains more than another, the rope frays. If the pivot is misaligned, the base shifts under stress. But you do not rush. You've done this hundreds of times, and each time the body remembers. You turn the capstan wheel with your legs, not your back. The torque builds like water pressing against a dam. The pulleys do their quiet magic, converting your strength into elevation. One revolution, then another. The stone rises by the width of a hand. And in that motion, something happens not just physically, but emotionally. A piece of the earth, once immovable, begins to float. The crane does not just lift, it transforms. It takes stone from the realm of gravity and places it within design. The moment the stone clears the ground, the building changes. This is no longer a dream marked in chalk. This is no longer a theory traced on wax. The building begins its birth. The men chant now, low and steady, not to energize but to synchronize. Every step of the capstan must match the pull of the guide rope. The crane operator adjusts the swivel arm with careful tugs. The stone turns, not wildly, but with stately grace, a slow rotation through air like a king entering his court. You walk below it, eyes locked on the shadows. The stone must pass between scaffolding beams. It must descend onto the waiting wall without scraping its edges. The margin for error is no wider than your knuckles. You raise a hand again. The chanting slows. The stone pauses mid-air. You adjust the swing by a breath's length, and then you let it down, not by pushing, not by pulling, but by easing the ropes through calloused fingers, one palm at a time. The sound it makes when it lands is not a thud. It is a sigh stone meeting stone, surface meeting memory. You step forward and tap the seam with a mallet. The sound echoes sharp and clean. Perfect contact. That is the music of masonry. But the crane is not always so graceful. There are days when wind makes it groan, when moisture in the ropes changes the weight load, when the scaffold sways and you must decide whether to continue or call the lift off. Pride has broken more stones than ignorance. And still, the machine endures. It is Roman in spirit, simple, efficient, beautiful through function. The power of one man, multiplied by gears and pulleys, raised to the labor of many. A stone that would crush 6 men can be moved by 2, if they know the balance point, if they understand the voice of tension. You teach the young men this slowly. You do not hand them the wheel on the first day. You make them wind ropes. You make them grease pulleys. You make them lift by hand wooden blocks at first, then slabs, then broken columns. You want their shoulders to remember the weight before their eyes trust the machine. Because the day will come when a crane breaks, and they will need to know how to build one from scratch. You have seen cranes made from salvaged ship parts, from timber found in ruins, from scaffold poles lashed together with ox hide. It is not the material that gives it power. It is the mind behind it, the understanding of balance, of counterweight, of the way a rope's tension shifts when the sun dries it too quickly. You have rebuilt one in the rain. You have lashed one to a cliff face with no foundation but prayer. You have watched a man walk along the counterweight beam with a bag of gravel in each hand, adjusting balance in real time as the column rose. You have never forgotten the look on his face, not fear, not bravery, but calculation. Every breath was a choice. And beneath all of this, beneath the cranes, the levers, the capstans, there is one final tool, the most important of all: muscle memory. You feel the weight before it lifts. You know, by sound alone, when a rope is about to fail. You sense, by pressure in the axle, when a beam has splintered internally. These are not things you can teach by diagram. They live in the body, in the slow accumulation of days spent in sun and cold, of calluses that split and heal, of nights when the work continues by torchlight because a storm threatens the next day. These things become instinct. You trust them more than numbers, and you trust the team whose movements mirror yours. When the master stonecutter tightens his grip, you know to pause. When the scaffold foreman glances at the sky, you know the wind has shifted. When the apprentice's voice falters in the chant, you know the strain is rising unevenly. No crane can replace that. No machine can substitute for the intimacy of shared labor. The crane lifts the stone, but it is the crew that breathes life into the motion. And when the last block is set, when the final lintel lands into place, with its iron clamps and dovetail grooves, you lower the ropes for the last time. The capstan wheel spins free. The air feels lighter. The crane creaks, unburdened. You step back and look at the building. It stands, but more than that, it remembers. It remembers the men who lifted it, the sweat they left on the ropes, the moments of silence before every motion. It remembers the balance, the tension, the breath of the crane. It remembers the muscle behind the mind, and that memory will hold long after you are gone. The stone alone is not enough. You have seen columns carved from Carrara and pediments chiseled into perfection, slabs wide as doors and arches strong enough to hold the sky crack, lean, collapse, not from the weakness of the stone, but from the silence between them, from the forgetting of what must flow, not stand. You know now that no Roman building is ever born from blocks alone. It is born from what binds them, the thing that moves between and holds what is still. You reach into the trough, and your hand disappears into gray. Mortar, not dust, not mud, not simple paste. This is a creation older than your grandfather's birth, yet smarter than any coin in the treasury. The recipe is no secret. Quicklime, sand, pozzolana volcanic ash pulled from the earth like it remembers fire. Add water, stir, wait, apply. Watch it breathe into stone. This mixture, plain and pale as it looks, is the thing that will outlast you. You do not rush this part. Even the most impatient overseers, the most ambitious architects with scrolls fluttering like wings, grow quiet when mortar is mixed, because they know everyone knows that the walls remember how they were made. If they were bound too dry, they will crumble. If they were poured too thin, they will ooze and split. But if done just right, they will hold for centuries. You have touched walls in Pompeii that still hum with this mix. You have seen aqueducts that were bound not with clamps, not with nails, but with this gray whisper of chemistry. And they still cradle water like they were laid yesterday. You know the feel of a good batch, not by look, not by stir, but by sound. When your trowel strikes it, it should sigh, not slap, not squelch, but breathe. A wet, gritty breath alive. There is no romance in the mixing. It is a violent, sweaty thing. Quicklime bites your skin. Pozzolana coats your arms in ash. The mixture heats as it reacts. Steam coils upward. It smells like caves and smoke and wet clay, all at once. But this is the alchemy of Rome. No gold, no transformation of lead, just ash turned to eternity. And yet, the mixture is only the beginning. The way it's used is what shapes time. You do not smear it. You seed it. You spread a thin line across one stone's spine, then press another atop it with the slow weight of certainty. Not too hard. Let it settle. Let the air squeeze out like a breath being held. Then strike twice, gently with the mallet to let the mortar shift. Spread, grip. The line must never be thick. Mortar is not filler. It is not apology for bad cutting. It is marriage. It does not stand instead of the stone. It lives between. You once saw a wall fall where every layer had too much mortar thick as a finger, lathered like bread with honey. It held for a year, maybe two. But then came rain, and the mortar cracked not from water, but from shame. It was never asked to hold. It was asked to pretend. Mortar does not like pretending. So you keep your mixture tight, your joints close, your heart steady. In domes, it is the silent partner. The Pantheon's eye still stares into the sky because the mortar knew how to hold what curved. It was poured into ribs and layers, blending with lightweight pumice stone, binding in a spiral like muscle around bone. That ceiling has no steel, no secret spine, just thousands of tons of thought floating, somehow, because mortar learned how to sing upward instead of sink. The best mortar speaks with time. It grows harder with age, not softer, not tired. It absorbs air, moisture, even memory. What you bind today will be stronger tomorrow. That is why you wait. You do not rush into decoration. You do not drape fresco or attach molding while the wall is still breathing. You give it a season to cure, to forget the wetness, to become a wall, not a wish. You teach this to the apprentices by giving them a single batch and watching how they panic when it begins to set. They race, they spill, they waste, But those who learn to respect the pace, the ones who know when to re-wet, when to remix, when to discard and start again, those are the ones who will one day build cities. The site has its own rhythm. By mid-morning, the sun begins to dry the outer layers too fast. By evening, the shadows make the curing uneven. You adjust. Always. Not with numbers. With skin. With instinct. You place a thumb into the line at the base of the apse and feel the give. Too soft. Wait. Too firm. Strike and lift. Replace. The mortar will always tell you what it needs if you listen. But not all mortar is gray. When building cisterns and baths, you mix a redder batch. You add crushed tiles, coccio pesto, to give it the strength to face water day and night. This mortar does not just hold. It resists. It refuses to weep, even when submerged for decades. Roman bathhouses, layered in this red mortar, have walls smoother than polished marble. Water slides off them like wine off wax. The secret, again, is patience. You cannot lay tile too soon. You must let the walls forget they were ever wet. Then seal them with lime wash, then polish. In fire-prone districts, near bakeries and forges, you alter the mixture again, less sand, more ash. Heat changes the breath of a wall. Mortar must adapt. You build not just for style, but for survival. A wall in Ostia might live in salt air. A wall in Antioch must brace for frost. The mortar changes with the land. You do not argue, you adjust. Even when building the foundations for roads, yes, roads, you use a version of it. Roman roads last not only because of stones and sand, but because of the layer of mortar beneath, sealing moisture out, keeping the subsoil from shifting. What seems like a simple pathway from town to town is, in truth, a lesson in binding. Mortar not just between walls, but beneath them. Mortar as memory beneath the march of thousands of feet. The empire has borders. Mortar does not. You've heard of lighthouses in Britannia, where Roman mortar still clings to sea-sprayed stone. You've seen aqueducts in Gaul, where the same mix used in the Forum holds arches above vineyards. You've traced your finger along frescoed halls in villas south of Naples, and the only thing keeping the colors from collapse is the thin mortar layer beneath the intonaco that receives the pigment like skin. Even the art depends on it. You mix special batches with marble dust, white and fine, for murals. You grind pigments into the wet layer while it's still soft, and because the color fuses as it dries, it does not fade. That is why Roman walls still sing with ochre and indigo, long after the empire fell. The mortar remembered, even when the painter was forgotten. And yet, for all this science, all this art, there is still something deeper. There is trust. You must trust that the mixture will cure, that the weather will not shift too quickly, that the batch will hold not just today, but in years you will never see. Mortar is your promise to the future. You will not be there to repair the wall when it cracks. You will not see the ceiling when it darkens with smoke from 100 winters. You will not feel the stair tremble under generations of feet. But you build as though you will. You mix carefully, not for praise, but for peace. You lay each stone not to show off, but to sleep better. Because you know the difference between buildings that last and buildings that beg for attention. The latter speak loud, the former remain, like breath held between ribs, like silence kept between sentences. The empire may rise and fall. The emperors may fade into busts and coins and broken statues, but the mortar will hold, not because it is perfect, but because it was made with care. And that is the final secret. Not the ash, not the lime, not the sand, but the hand that stirred it and the heart that waited. You are in the shadow of a vault. You don't look up at first. You never do. You approach it the way a mason does, one foot on packed earth, one hand brushing the curve where wall becomes ceiling. The line is not visible, but you feel it. The transition is silent, seamless, like an exhale in the middle of a sentence. And still, you don't look up, not until your ears catch the way voices rise in this space, not until your boots feel the temperature shift, not until the weight of the ceiling above presses down, not with fear, but with calm. Only then do you look, and there it is, stone suspended like thought, curved like the sky, wide as ambition. A Roman vault does not ask for praise. It exists like a law final, fixed, necessary. You do not marvel at it as you would a statue or a painted dome. You accept it. You walk beneath it. You speak in its echo. You hear your voice stretched by the curve, carried to corners, absorbed into lime-washed bricks and mortar. But long before it ever held sound, it held uncertainty. You remember the first time you built one? The drawing was simple, just an arc scratched onto a wax tablet, a semicircle, a rib, a rise. It looked small, manageable. But as you marked the base onto the ground, and the stones began to stack along the wooden form, doubt crept into the joints. The weight grew heavier with each course. The space beneath darkened. The wood groaned. And you wondered, how can this hold? It was not the stone that frightened you. It was the air. Because that is what a vault holds: nothing. It encloses absence. It binds pressure to geometry. It lifts, not by escaping gravity, but by reorganizing it. Every brick, every wedge-shaped voussoir is pulled downward, yet the curve itself stands not by resisting collapse, but by redistributing failure into form. Roman engineers knew this, not by formulas, not by theoretical diagrams, but by failure. Many vaults fell before one held. They learned to layer thick, to stagger joints, to mix mortar with volcanic ash for flexibility. They discovered that the secret was not just arching upward, but extending depth, making the vault barrel-like, so that its force ran longitudinally as well as radially. You learned, too. You stood beneath your first completed vault long after the wooden formwork was taken down. The keystone at the center, once supported by timber and hope, now floated seemingly without effort. The silence was different beneath it, not because it was quiet, but because the space felt whole. It had become one single structure, no longer stone and mortar, but a single, cohesive breath held in brick. Later, you walked through the basilicae, those grand vaulted halls where light filters in from high windows and the floors echo with legal steps and whispered judgments. Each vault stretched broader than the last. Some began to intersect, crisscrossing like woven branches, forming groins where the forces merged and held. These groin vaults, clever, weightless seeming, became your obsession. You studied how their ribs met at angles, how they channeled weight not down, but out, into piers and side walls. You began to realize something. The vault was not a ceiling, it was a negotiation. Between weight and will, between collapse and balance, between stone that wanted to fall and geometry that wouldn't let it. No wonder the Romans used them in their thermae baths, where fire and steam and water challenged every material. You once built one such vault in a caldarium where heat rose constantly, licking the brickwork like tongues of invisible flame. Ordinary construction would have cracked, split, disintegrated. But your vault stood, because its weight was not opposed to itself, because every force moved toward support, because it was honest. The hypocaust below sent heat upward. The flue tiles embedded in the walls channeled it outward, and the vault, curved and layered and thick with pozzolanic mortar, breathed. It didn't fight the heat. It cooperated. The ceiling sweated, but never wept. The bricks expanded, but did not separate. You walked barefoot beneath it, feeling the warmth rise evenly, and you whispered thanks to Vitruvius and all his unwritten laborers. It is not just temples and baths that vaults made possible. It is time. You return, years later, to a warehouse near Ostia. It has no columns, no carved figures, no gold leaf or marble, just brick and curve, a series of vaults running one into the next, like a rib cage half buried in sand. It once held grain, or oil, or wine. Now it holds dust, but the vaults still rise, still arch, still carry the absence of collapse. There's a strength in repetition. You've learned. The Romans knew it well. Vault after vault after vault, barrel, groin, cloister, each a solution refined, repeated, reinforced. A language spoken in curve and brick, a vocabulary of silence. And above all these, in your memory, stands the testudo of all Roman vaulting, the Pantheon. Its dome begins as a vault, but becomes more a sphere, a world, an idea cast in stone. It rises not from columns, but from a drum, a ring of support that accepts the impossible. The dome thickens as it descends, lightens as it rises. The concrete mix changes by layer. The lower sections are heavy with basalt. The upper layers are feathered with pumice. The entire structure was poured in courses, with wooden ribs and careful calculation. And when the formwork was finally removed, it stood. It still stands. You have stared into the oculus at its center, the open eye of the building, and felt your own breath slow. Light enters like revelation. Rain, when it falls, is welcomed, not feared. The floor beneath slopes ever so slightly, allowing water to drain. The design anticipates failure and redirects it. The vault above does not deny the sky. It receives it. And in that moment, standing beneath the vastest vault the Romans ever dared, you understand something simple. Vaults resist collapse not because they are strong, but because they are generous. They distribute what others would hoard. They share pressure. They invite balance. They let each brick help the next. And so they endure. You think now of the vaults in your life, the ones in bridges, in tombs, in aqueduct crossings, even in sewers. Vaults hold their shape, unthanked, unseen, but essential. Rome does not stand on columns. Rome stands on vaults, quiet, curved, wise. And as your hand touches the keystone one last time, you remember what the master builder once told you. Long ago, the straight line is proud, but the curve is wise. You smile, and you walk forward beneath the wisdom. The empire has long since crumbled, but the buildings have not. You walk today through streets that no longer speak Latin, where olive trees grow wild beside concrete that once guided an emperor's chariot. And in the distance, beyond the clamor of modern horns and shifting skylines, a Roman structure still waits in the light, unchanged and unafraid. It does not flinch from the weather. It does not answer to time. It simply remains one of many. For what the Romans built, they built not for now, but for endurance. Some structures stand like memories with edges. Others, more defiant, continue to serve as bridges, crossed daily by tourists who don't know they're stepping on engineering older than Christianity, as amphitheaters echoing with laughter and song, though the roar of lions is gone, as aqueducts whose once proud arches have been swallowed by suburbs, but whose bones still whisper of water drawn from miles away. There is no empire now, no Caesar, no Senate, no SPQR etched freshly into stone. And yet, you cannot escape the feeling that Rome never really died. It simply changed form, like water poured from one vessel to another. Because when you walk into a Roman structure, you walk into a philosophy. The walls don't just hold weight, they hold intention. Every arch is a decision. Every brick, an agreement between force and balance. Every vault, a meditation on gravity and grace. They did not build to impress the gods, though they did that too, but to outlive their own fears of disappearance. And somehow, they succeeded. You've stood beneath arches where keystones still hold, because no one dared to challenge the geometry. You've traced your hand along columns whose flutes still run with rainwater. Though the temples they once adorned are roofless, birds now nesting where banners once hung, the world changed, but the column did not. Its strength was not in the empire, it was in the design. You've descended into baths once filled with marble echoes and steam, now home to lichen and echoes of sandals that will never return. And even in ruin, you felt the warmth still stored in the walls, the memory of human presence, of rituals performed in heat and water, of laughter rising with the mist. What still stands today is more than just stone. It is process. The mortars that harden with breath, the vaults that channel stress into stillness, the domes that seem to lift heavenward, not with force, but with permission. These are not accidents. These are the results of builders who respected both weight and air. They knew that permanence begins with humility. The Pantheon still holds the sky not because it demanded the gods descend, but because it allowed light to enter through an open wound. Its oculus was not a weakness, it was a gift. A hole not for collapse, but for understanding that what is open can still hold, and that darkness is not an enemy, but a canvas. And across the empire's former edges, from Britain to Syria, you see the same principle unfold in brick and curve and repetition. Not grand gestures, but grounded ones. Not palaces for display, but forums for argument. Cisterns for survival. Walls not meant to inspire awe, but to provide shade, direction, and protection. They built for utility, and from that utility emerged an accidental beauty, and that beauty endures. Even where only fragments remain, there is power in what survives. A single arch can speak louder than 1,000 modern towers. A broken apse can contain more silence than any untouched room. The stones do not need completeness to communicate meaning. They only need memory. And you, the modern walker among ruins, become part of that memory. You become the final ingredient. Because these structures were not meant to be admired from a distance, but to be inhabited, to be touched, to be entered. Their scale invites you in. Their proportions calm the breath. The way the light pools in corners, the way the shadows stretch across old masonry. It creates a kind of rhythm, a language your body understands before your mind catches up. There is something almost holy in that rhythm, but not the kind of holiness bound to altars and prayers. No, this is a secular holiness, a reverence for order, for proportion, for the dignity of materials used wisely. The Romans believed, perhaps more deeply than any civilization before them, that architecture was a civic act, that to build well was not just a skill, it was a duty. And what still stands today proves that they honored that duty. You notice it in the simplest things, a threshold worn down not by intention, but by passage, a set of steps angled just slightly to catch the afternoon sun, a gutter designed to sing softly when rain begins to fall. These are not accidents. They are traces of care, of long thinking, of a worldview that measured worth not in years, but in endurance. And perhaps that is what makes Roman architecture different from so much that followed. They did not build to impress their own era. They built to vanish into the background of someone else's, to disappear into usefulness, to allow beauty to emerge from strength, not the other way around. So much of what followed history's arc tried to mimic Rome's appearance, the columns, the domes, the symmetry. But few tried to replicate the thinking behind it, the labor, the modesty of design, the refusal to cut corners even when no one would notice. You understand that now because you have been inside those spaces and you have felt what still stands. It is not just about the survival of concrete or stone. It is the survival of a certain kind of soul, a soul that believed human beings deserved not just shelter, but spaces that made them feel calm, structures that helped them speak more clearly, think more fully, breathe more deeply. The basilicas encouraged thought, the forums encouraged voice, the baths encouraged rest. The aqueducts reminded people that water should flow, and the roads, always the roads, told everyone the same thing: move forward, but never forget what's behind you. And that's where you are now, not just walking through ruins, but walking through reminders that greatness is not always loud, that legacy does not always wear gold, that sometimes the strongest thing a civilization can do is to leave behind buildings that need no introduction, only footsteps. You stand now at the edge of a broken bridge. One arch remains. The rest is lost to the river and time. But you don't feel sadness. You feel gratitude. Because even in ruin, the design is clear. The intention survives. And maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. To leave behind not perfection, but principles. Not monuments, but meanings. Not declarations, but questions. Questions like, what will you build? What will stand when you are gone? Will it be made with the kind of care that turns ash into stone and stone into silence? Because if it is, then perhaps, just perhaps, it too will remain. Long after you are forgotten. Long after your name fades from scrolls and screens alike. Long after this empire falls. What still stands today is not just Rome. What still stands is the proof that humans, for a moment, built like they meant it.